Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Today is Tuesday, April 28th, 2020, starting at 11:15 a.m. here in Denver, Colorado, and this is the 253rd episode of the show. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with astrologers Kelly Surtees and Austin Coppock about the astrological forecast for May of 2020. Hey guys, welcome to the show.
Hey,
Hey
Chris.
guys.
Hey, so for those just starting the video version of this episode, usually we try to jump right into the forecast first, but we're going to spend a little bit of time talking and catching up and reviewing the past month, and then eventually we'll get into the astrological forecast for May. So for those of you that just want to jump straight to the forecast, just look in the description either below this video or on the Astrology Podcast website on the description page for this episode if you're listening to the audio version. And there you'll find a timestamp so that you can jump straight forward to the forecast and skip the preliminary talk that we're going to have for the next, 30 minutes or so. All right, so here we are. We are back again after, a month? It's been a really crazy month in the world in general and in our lives in general. I've been sick still for the past month. It actually turned into like a 6-week-long illness that I'm just finally fully coming out of now. And the last lingering issues is just dealing with fatigue and getting tired. But I'm starting to get back to doing podcast episodes after a really long gap there because I actually got more sick after we did our last one and sort of took a few steps back, which I wasn't anticipating. How have you guys been doing?
How are things in
Uh,
Belgium, Kelly?
Yeah. Just it's very quiet here in Belgium. We've, just like everyone else, lockdown conditions. Being someone who has worked online for a really long time, there's a sense of kind of a familiarity because I'm working in ways that I would have been otherwise. So it's sort of a weird thing of like, yes, there's a lot that's different and new that's going on that is, of course, affecting us. We were supposed to have a trip back to Canada to see family in April, which we clearly didn't do. So it's just been sort of a weird, surreal experience of some things being really familiar, working online as normal, but other things just being very weird and very strange and very different. How about you
Yeah, that
guys,
makes a lot of
Austin?
sense. I can relate to that. I've worked online and from home for a decade plus, and so there's some things that are utterly normal. Obviously, travel plans got smashed, but it's still experientially very different to be doing the same thing while the entire rest of the world is not. Right? Or it
Yeah.
seems like that. The context is a little bit different. I would say it's been really interesting to me to see people en masse engaging with the self-scheduling challenge that and you as well, Chris, have been living with for a long time, right? And it's self-scheduling it is its own skill set, it is its own monumental challenge. Like it's not something you just know how to do and are great at. And so I don't know, it's been really interesting to like see other people engaging with something that's just been part of my normal and seeing my normal from a new angle because of that. And I've also realized like I've learned some things about it. I don't live up to my own standards, but I'm better at it than I used to be. And it's been kind of fun to be like, oh, well, so I use this trick to get myself to do the right thing at the right time of day. And so that's been part of it.
Yeah, well, and we're all extraordinarily lucky where we happen to have jobs where we can work from home for the most part, in terms of me doing the podcast or you guys teaching online classes or doing consultations through Zoom. And yeah, everybody's starting to like use Zoom and other online platforms suddenly, but it's something that we were a little ahead of the curve on.
Yeah, but I have noticed that I have been slightly less productive than normal, that um, taking time and energy to process myself, all the emotions with everything that's going on collectively, I have noticed my productivity has come down a percentage. And I've just sort of said, you know what? this is not normal times, even though, as we're saying, working from home is our baseline of normal. It's not happening in an environment, or as you said, Austin, a context that is normal. And I'm just, I've just reduced a couple of things because I'm like, I need to be mindful that some of my energy is going to manage myself in this global pandemic space. And I just can't, go at that level work-wise that I might normally when things are more familiar out there.
Well, and it's fascinating
That's
how much of the Mars Saturn conjunction that we talked about so much in the forecast, the year ahead forecast for the entirety of 2020 during this part of the year. I think I used the analogy of Mars Saturn being like, pressing the gas in your car and the brake at the same time, and like wanting to move forward, but also being stopped and being immobile at the same time. And that ended up being like a really evocative description of most people's experience of this time, especially over the past month during like a worldwide quarantine where lots of people are stuck at home or being forced to, like not do what they otherwise would do due to the restrictions or due to the fear of getting sick or what have you.
I've actually had oh, go ahead, Kelly.
Oh, I was just going to say, the timelines are different. You can't make plans for 6 months from now or 9 months from now. You can kind of focus on the next week, and that's about it. So there's been a real adjustment in sort of planning, and that Mars Saturn, like Mars immediate, Saturn long term. And, we've had to really shift and not do both at the same time. That's for sure.
Right.
So
Austin?
I've had sort of the opposite response to the same stimulus, Kelly. I've been more productive.
Interesting.
Like the ambient, how should we say, danger, risk, dark timeness makes me feel like, okay, well, I definitely need to get shit done. It's motivating for me. When there's lower risk in the environment where I perceive that, it makes me lazier. Whereas when there's risk, and I think this is me having Mars Saturn opposition in the natal.
Yeah.
Where it fires that. And it's like, okay, let's survive, right? Like let's survive super well. I've been more disciplined about my diet. I've been more disciplined about strength training. And I've been noticing people who have like Mars Saturn conjunctions or oppositions having a similar response where they're like, okay, yeah, it's serious. Let's do this. Which is, it makes sense that if you're a Mars Saturn person, that Mars Saturn time would feel even not comfortable, but familiar.
Familiar. Yeah. That's a really interesting point.
So, and just to wrap things up in terms of the health thing, because a lot of people were writing in to ask me after last month what was going on, and then I didn't do any podcast episodes for several weeks. We think that I got COVID. I did end up going into the urgent care or like an emergency room at one point due to a pain that developed in my right lung, and I needed to get x-rays, but I wasn't able to get tested because they were reserving the tests only for people in critical condition. Which was kind of an interesting experience because it made me realize that despite how many people have been tested and how many confirmed cases there are, those numbers are probably actually lower if they're not even testing people unless they have the most severe cases in some areas or in a major like metropolitan city like Denver. But luckily I've been coming out of it and doing all right. It's been an interesting thing in terms of a 12th house perfection year for me. And Kelly, you made an observation about that where everyone's sort of quarantined at home right now, but I've got an even more extreme like 12th house version of that where I've been stuck in my room for like the past 6 weeks, not going out because I'm trying not to get my partner Lisa sick, and that's been a challenge.
Yeah, it just seems like, well, if everybody else is already at home, what's the more 12th house iteration of that, I guess? And being stuck in a bedroom for such a long time, that there's a lot of isolation themes that come up with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really, go ahead.
No, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see how these transits are landing in individual charts and how that describes the experience. So, for example, I entered a sixth house perfection, topics such as health, on March 5th, right before all this got going. And so, I was going to be focused on health anyway. And so this has rather sharpened that focus. But I did want to add just one tiny little happy side of a sixth house perfection is the sixth house is also where we see pets. And I think we're finally going to get a new kitten. We're talking about this. So not only we were looking at potential candidates yesterday, and this morning I woke up horribly underslept right around dawn, and there were some deer out in the front yard, and there was a little cat. And I opened my office door and I said, "Hey, little cat." He just came right into my office, just started meowing and inspecting everything. I have a scratcher in here for my cat, and he just like laid down, got to work on the scratcher, et cetera, et cetera. And it's funny, right? Because it's just like, oh, it's pet time. It's a sixth house perfection. It's pet time. I've never had a cat just walk into my house and be friendly. And then within 12 hours of being like, yeah, we should see if we should, looking at kitten, like literally not kitten shopping, but looking at the new batch from a breeder, right? 12 hours of that, 12 hours later, boom, new cat in the office.
Wow.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Sixth house perfection.
Yeah. And
in terms of, so as I was sitting in my room for the past 6 weeks, thinking about my 12th house perfection year, one of the things that I realized is it's
the best example. I mean, it's a horrible situation, but the symbolism.
Well, one of the things I realized is that the first house isn't just the self, which is really common across astrological traditions, but it also has to do with self-agency, agency of the self. Mm-hmm. And if that's true, if you look at the entire angular triad of the sequence of the 12th, the first, and the second, if the first house is self-agency and the second house is rising up towards the first and is increasing, then the second is like the increase of self-agency, which is kind of interesting because that's one of the things that allows you to have an increase of self-agency is if you have greater financial means. That's something that sometimes people associate with the ability to do what you want or call the shots or have greater control, whereas the 12th house would be the declining house relative to the first house angular triads. The 12th is the loss of self-agency, which then becomes a perfect archetypal descriptor for many of the things that you find in the 12th house, such as prison or hospitals or other things. And it would mean that like the combining factor, the overarching archetype for all of those is like the loss of self-agency or situations in which you find yourself with a loss of self-agency. And that's what ties together all of those 12th house topics.
Yeah, that's really good. And that actually, almost this exact topic came up in my year 2 class on Sunday. I literally ended up ranking the houses in terms of how agentic or how much agency you have there. Right. Like the first house, obviously being number 1 for agency, and either the 12th or the 6th being, being last on the list as far as places where 1, you have power, and 2, places where you can expect a planet to be something that you do. Right. When a planet is in the 12th, there's some of the what you do or what you accidentally do, but it very often, same with the 6th, they will very often tend to mark events that are not under your control, right? Things that happen to you, or rather than things that you happen to.
Right.
It's funny, all this focus on the 12th as well. I did a webinar at the start of April looking at the 8th and 12th houses, and that setting of the 12th house, the loss of agency, is such a poetic description. And of course, nature of the planets in the 12th. Are you in the loss of self-agency space because you personally have lost your agency, or are you in that space acting as a helper or a support for other people who have lost their agency?
Right, which is the positive manifestations that you see oftentimes with 6th and 12th house placements, especially if they're like career significators.
And
people working and helping professions.
Yeah, I had an example this morning, and it was a long-term client of mine. It was so good. And I was like, oh my God, do you mind if I used your chart for teaching purposes? And they were like, absolutely, go right ahead. They have a daytime chart with an Aries MC, and Mars is in Gemini in the 12th. And they work with female victims of abuse and trauma. They work as a therapist in that environment. And they're very passionate about giving people in those situations a voice, which I thought was just such a poetic symbolism of the Mars Gemini 12th house. Let me be your advocate and help you find your voice as you
Mhm.
recover from these very horrific Mars situations that you have survived.
Yeah,
Right.
well, and think
Right.
about
It makes
all
a
of
lot of
the.
sense.
I have an example like that in my book of like a doctor that I met once who was a client that had the ruler of the ascendant in the 10th and the 6th, and they focused on especially patient care and improving like the care of patients in the hospital. Um,
That's
but
right. I
think,
remember that example from your book. It's a great one.
yeah, but think about all of the. I mean, that raises like all of the doctors right now. Like I've read stories about all the doctors eventually needing to get therapy due to just the trauma of what they're witnessing right now and like the scale of deaths that are taking place just over the course of the past month, which is something they deal with on a regular basis, but not to this level. Just in terms of, I don't
Yeah,
know,
I'm like,
people that have 6th and 12th house placements, and we're talking about like a positive manifestation of that, but still, there could be negative effects of working in that environment in some extreme instances, let's say, just in terms of what you're being exposed to.
Yeah, I mean, when I
absolutely.
worked
Absolutely.
in a past life, maybe 15, 20 years ago, I worked in mental health in a variety of jobs. And it's the wear and tear on the people at every level working in mental health is huge. A lot of people just like
Right.
can only do it for so long. And I'm sure that that applies to people working in physical health situations, although the two are very often paired. It's kind of
Yeah.
upsetting to have your physical body hurt. And when the mind is not doing well, the body rarely thrives.
Right. Or even just being exposed to things like right now, all of the doctors and nurses and other medical professionals being exposed to COVID and putting their lives on the line and their health on the line, as well as families in some instance, by trying to help people. Um, yeah.
It does strike me a little bit as representative of the Mars Aquarius, Saturn Aquarius. This sort of, I often think about Mars in an air sign as describing what could be disturbances in the mind or disturbances in the thinking processes, and that aggravation that Mars does, which can see an increase in things like anxiety and other mental health concerns. And that's something that is starting to get a little bit of press right now for the health workers and just for the general population with the levels of isolation and disconnect. But I think we're going to see a lot more of that being talked about and discussed, particularly, as we look into May and see Mars making a few changes. But that idea of talking more about mental health and taking care of our mindset seems very much connected to some of this air sign emphasis.
Definitely. I
Sure.
especially see that with Mars and air signs. Mars and air signs it's like the ambient anxiety levels are always higher
Yeah.
because Mars kind of spins its gears or its wheels or
Yes.
propellers in air signs. It's not the right element to get traction. And so you have that getting spun up, but not necessarily having anything to do about it, which results
Yeah.
in, the experience of which is anxiety.
Sure. All right. So just to check in, since it's been a month now, I wanted to do a little news segment. I mean, part of the news is checking in about where things have come over the past month since we did our last episode in terms of the pandemic with COVID-19. So I was looking up some numbers on the Johns Hopkins University website today before we started this episode. And here's a little map that they have on their website to show for the video viewers to show confirmed cases. And they're saying that there's over 3 million confirmed cases worldwide as of today, April 28th, 2020. There's been over 212,000 deaths, 212,000 deaths. Almost 1 million cases have been diagnosed in the US alone. And there's been over 55,000 deaths from the coronavirus in the United States, and most of these occurred within the past month. And some of those numbers are coming from the Washington Post that has a graph and a list of like the number of deaths that have been reported, as well as the number of new reported cases that have been reported each day. So wanted to mention that just because that kind of sets the tone for what the last month has been like in the world in general, and sort of where we are going into May before we get to the forecast, as well as checking in terms of any statements that we made last month where we were focused so much on the Mars-Saturn conjunction and the continuation of that co-presence that we'll come back to and talk a lot about this episode. Other news, though, before we get there, last month we weren't sure yet because it hadn't been finalized, I don't think, but the Northwest Astrology Conference did formally announce that they were canceling their in-person conference and they were switching it to an entirely online conference due to the pandemic. So they still took a major financial hit due to the hotel and due to some of the contracts and negotiations with the hotel, but it's actually kind of an opportunity now for a lot of people because they're opening up their ability to sign up for new registrants so that anybody could sign up for the conference, and they're going to have all of the same lectures, which actually had a really amazing lecture lineup this year, are going to be available as online webinars. And it's going to be streamed live the day of the conference. And then if you sign up for the full conference, you get access to every lecture, I think, for a 2-week period after the conference is over, which is something kind of unique that you never would have gotten previously if you like attended it in person, and you can just see, you know, a certain number of lectures while you're there. So you guys are both speaking at that conference this year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yes, we are.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's kind of a bummer that the in-person conference isn't happening, but I'm glad at least that they're still doing an online conference.
Yeah, I'm totally bummed not to, see everyone and hang out in the bar in between, but it'll be fun to at least be able to share the material and have those connections online. I think it is kind of cool that everyone will have access to the lectures for 2 weeks after the fact, because I don't know about you, but when I attend a conference live, I can get to only just a few lectures, not all of them, but over 2 weeks, I'd have the chance to see them all, which I think is kind of cool. And then, Austin and I are actually both giving workshops at the end of that conference. So Monday, May 25th, I'll be teaching on the predictive pot of gold, how to combine transits and progressions in your forecasts. And Austin, what are you presenting on? I think something special.
Oh, the decans.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to spend an afternoon going through all 36 and then going over some decan specific techniques that we can find in traditional texts.
Yeah. And so the conference itself is $275 for the full conference, US dollars. Austin's workshop and my workshop, if you want to attend as part of the conference, it's $100 to add that on to your conference registration. And if you just want to come to either Austin's workshop or my workshop, you can do just that, and it's $130.
Yeah, so that's
lots of
pretty
options.
Cool. Yeah, I'm glad that they're doing that, and I hope that works out. I'm sure it will work out. I mean, it seems like it's working out pretty well so far. Here's the website, which is norwac.net. If you want to get more information, sign up for the newsletter or what have you. I hope they get a decent turnout, because that's one of the real threats, is because of what a huge financial investment these conferences are. That's one of the reasons they happen not that frequently. And I know there was one in 2008 that happened where a single guy was organizing it, and it happened right around the time of the financial collapse. And he lost a lot of money, and then he never did any more of those conferences. So I'm hoping people sort of take that into account when they're looking at NORWAC and thinking about signing up, as wanting to support it, not just to get the information involved and everything, but also in terms of things to help the community keep going. So you can find out more information about that at norwac.net. In other news, the other major conference this year is the International Society for Astrological Research is still saying that they're going to hold their conference in Denver, Colorado in September. They're still waiting to see what happens, but they're not going to make any final decisions until June or July is what I'm being told, but that things are still tentatively scheduled to happen. They're looking into other options and other contingency plans, but it sounds like it's another situation where they're even more sort of tied into contractual stuff with the hotel, so that it could be disastrous if it didn't happen for some reason in terms of both Isar and Isar's just financial situation, as well as Isar's ability to contribute to future conferences like the next United Astrology Conference, where talks are already starting to happen about having that take place in 2020 at some point. And if the Isar conference completely fell through, it might essentially remove their ability to be a player in that conference. So yeah, so I'm hoping the Isar conference still happens to some extent, although it's interesting then if it was to happen in September, they're talking about how to do a conference safely in this context, and like what safety looks like in terms of what you would have to put in place in order to do a conference safely, and still make it like fun and like it was normally.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because I know it's a little further out than some countries have announced travel restrictions around, but I think it's going to be very hard for people to get into the States from outside the country at that time. And most countries will potentially still be insisting on a quarantine period. So, that in and of itself could be prohibitive for people wanting to come into the US to attend that conference. So I don't envy them. They're in such a tough position to try and make a decision around this.
Yeah, and even like I was thinking, like if they did do it in person, like what do you require, or what can you require? Like should everybody wear, because I'm thinking about like 50, 60 people being packed into a small lecture room. Like remember some of the lecture rooms at UAC, and like do people need to wear masks? Is that something that's optional? Is that something that is like should be required? Should everybody be wearing masks? Thinking about some of those logistical issues was starting to hurt my head in terms of what you would do in that instances. And obviously they would have some really tough decisions to make there as well. So we'll check in again about that at some point in the future. But in the meantime, that's where we're currently at in terms of that news. Have you guys had any other news or things going on in the past month that you wanted to mention or talk about?
I mean, we could talk about baking recipes, maybe. I mean, this is what Zoom calls with everyone is like. So what have you been up to? Just hanging out at home.
Well, so I actually have a point connected to the baking surge
The baking surge.
April 2020. No, I was just thinking about that and a couple other things, and how it is not Uranus in Taurus which timed this epidemic. It was Mars, Saturn, Pluto, but maybe some Jupiter too. But you can see the what has been happening and what will continue to happen, sort of executing on all of Uranus and Taurus's historical moves, right? Like big volatility and disruptions in food supply, and in food production methods.
Right.
So I had a couple things. There are a couple. Well, and yeah. So there's that. There was disruptions around labor, right? Because not only are a lot of people not going to work, but people are also rethinking work, right? A lot of what were referred to as shit jobs 2 months ago are now essential jobs. And you see what kind of work is actually necessary for a society to not fall apart. And then there's also just kind
essential, of quote unquote essential.
Right. Well, and there's there's some questionable choices being made there. There are lots of questionable choices being made these days. But then also on a sort of a deeper level with Uranus and Taurus, questions of what is valuable, right? What is actually valuable? Like, what should we be prioritizing? I think a lot of things have been thrown, a lot of priorities and ideas about what's valuable and necessary have been thrown into stark relief, right? I think a lot of people are reassessing what they thought was important, essential within their own lives even. And that's all classic Uranus and Taurus stuff, right? And so you
Yeah,
can
that's
see that
great.
as like a rider on all this.
That was a great list because I just saw a story about something like Tyson Foods announcing in a story just in the past day that the food supply chain was breaking down. And that's a great like Uranus and Taurus manifestation in terms of some of the things. Also, lots of people in industries who previously were only done in person suddenly like finding ways to do a variation of that industry online in order to like make money online and change to that to speak to your point. Yeah, that's a lot of really interesting manifestations of Uranus and Taurus that are coming out in not surprising ways, but ways that make a lot of sense right now.
Yeah, well, and it's this just occurred to me, I think, yesterday as I was kind of going over like, what do I have to say on the podcast? And I think this is in part more obvious because we just had a new moon in Taurus on top of Uranus. And so it's like kind of right there. But yeah, Kelly bringing up the baking surge made me think of it. Kate did some successful and some unsuccessful baking experiments, right? Uranus and Taurus baking experiments recently. There is a keto pizza crust recipe, which had rave reviews and was in one of the greatest disappointments of our shared life.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear. We'll have to trade.
It's a real tragedy.
I have some Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to have to trade. I have some GF, gluten-free, dairy-free pizza crust recipes that would definitely qualify as keto. Yeah. But the thing with the baking is that people are making stuff from scratch, which I think is so Uranus in Taurus. Like people are trying to do sourdough starters at home or, baked goods, not from a box, but actually mixing the ingredients. I mean, Peter and I do like to cook a lot, but I've never, there's recipes that are a little bit more complicated that we had never previously attempted. And one of the ones we're so proud of is a Indian butter chicken dish that has ghee in it, but other than that, it doesn't have cream. And it was amazing. Easier than we expected it to be. So things like that you wouldn't normally think, like we normally wouldn't be like, make the time, to do it. So I think, totally co-sign on the Uranus and Taurus rider.
Well, and the what you were saying there about making things from scratch, like being inventive, innovative, original, these are all Uranus keywords, with very material, basic things.
Yeah.
Right? Taurus.
Flour, eggs.
Not everybody who is born under the sign of Taurus is basic, but Taurus does connect us to a lot of basic, or we could say fundamental things like, well, what are you going to do about food? Right? Where does the food come from? If you can't, if the restaurant will not make you the food you like, how are you going to get the food you like? Yeah. So I love that. Yeah.
Totally.
In terms of like supply stuff breaking down, one of the things that's interesting that I only noticed just because I'm a podcaster and trying to do interviews this month is you cannot get webcams and microphones that I've been trying to send out that I'd normally just like order on Amazon and they'd be there in a few days. I can't send them out to guests because everybody is now talking online using Zoom in order to communicate or do their job or everything else. And all that stuff is just like sold out, which is a really interesting thing that I only happen to notice as a podcaster. But going back to your point, Austin.
Okay.
What? Go ahead.
I just had one quick thing to add that I think that's really interesting. So, even though there are a lot of, business as a whole is way down, but there are certain goods and there's certain services that now are in massive demand. And that's the Uranus and Taurus thing. It's not like everything is sloped down. It's volatile and spiky. Yep. And one company is going to have 3 times the profit that they expected, whereas 5 others are going to have 1/3. And anyway, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah.
No, the spiky is good. Yeah. There's a particular company in Canada that I get some of my natural health food products from. And for about a 4-week period, they're like, we are only taking a certain amount of orders a day because we're just overwhelmed right now and we need time to get through our backlog. And I was like, how can you not be taking orders? But they were so overwhelmed that they just couldn't keep up. Chris, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm just so excited about the spiking.
I want to come back to later when we get into the forecast that's happening this month about Jupiter stationing conjunct Pluto and just the immense shifts in wealth and amounts of money that are shifting around right now that I think are very much connected with that conjunction of Jupiter Pluto. Yeah, that I definitely want to talk about later. But just going back to do a little bit, there's a little bit of a thing following up on some of the predictions and the statements we made in our last forecast that have been working out in interesting ways, especially over the past few days that you mentioned, Austin, as the sun moved into Taurus, especially, and started to come up and conjoined Uranus over the past week. It's been interesting seeing. I remember you, Austin, saying that you really were expecting people to start getting a little stir crazy by that point, or something to that effect, due to the lockdown. And over the past week, we've really started to see not just that happen, but then suddenly this push, at least in the US, for a lessening of the restrictions and some of the arguments surrounding that.
Yeah, I mean, we literally saw right around that new moon, I don't know, a dozen in-person protests about this all over the U.S. It was it was very literal. Yeah, I think I said something about like people are gonna, Uranus is very like, give me freedom or give me death. Like it stirs up that like, Mel Gibson Braveheart energy, and so. That with that Saturn squaring Uranus, which we're going to get a lot of next year, but we're getting a preview of now, seeing the sun and moon on top of Uranus. I just guess that people would be fucking over it, or a noticeable amount of people would be fucking ready for something.
Which was tricky because some of that was just like astroturfed or was being manipulated by whoever that was trying to push for opening up the economy and things like that again in order to create artificial protest movements. But then obviously some of it and a lot of it was genuine as well, in terms of after a month, large decent segment of the population wanting a lessening of the restrictions, and the tension between those two polar opposites really manifesting around the time of that new moon in Taurus that went exact on April 22nd.
Yep.
So, and there's a little Washington Post story, just to sort of give some objective like evidence for that. The date was April 25th, and it just says reopening of America accelerates as states prepare to relax coronavirus restrictions. So what we're seeing there is obviously not just the new moon that's taking place or that took place on the 22nd conjunct Uranus very closely within 3 degrees, but also, we're at the halfway point by then of Mars making its way through Aquarius and finally getting some distance. So by the 22nd, it was up to 15 degrees away from Saturn. And by May, as we'll start talking about soon, Mars will finally leave Aquarius and move into Pisces in the middle of May, finally completing at least the sign-based conjunction or co-presence with Saturn, which so much of the lockdowns, at least in the US, have been centered around.
Yeah, I mean, and that was the timeline. That was the timeline we gave for when, like, the hard quarantine phase would be over most places, was when Mars left co-presence with Saturn in mid-May, and things appear to be, how should we say, on their way to validating that prediction.
One other quick recap from April. I think, Chris, you had picked April 18 as the election for that month, where we had those double sextiles with Mercury, Venus, and then Mercury, Mars. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about
Lisa
that.
Picked that.
Lisa picked it, sorry. That you had shared that, and that's Lisa's work. So definitely let's give Lisa the contribution there. But that was when there was that big Together at Home concert where a number of top musicians and artists around the world came together and performed. I think they were like live streaming on YouTube. I saw a performance that had Celine Dion, Andrea Bocelli, Lady Gaga, and John Legend. And I think there was a series over that weekend, which I just thought, we had picked, Lisa had picked that weekend as the election, and we talked about that being a weekend where there were a couple of sort of decent aspects that month. So we didn't have the in-person gathering, but there was this sort of musical community coming together online.
Well, and that's Mercury, really cool. Mercury-Venus sextile perfect is great for the arts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love when that happens.
Yeah.
when we pick out elections each month, just like looking at what not just the best chart is, but sometimes the most notable or like dynamic chart is for starting something. And then sometimes like important events fall on that date just of their own accord.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I
Somebody
know
either has an astrologer or good intuition.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah, well, I know, and then some astrologers, I saw a tweet by Marin Altman, who's a listener and a patron the other day, saying that she loves waiting for the release of our Auspicious Elections podcast each month, where we put out like 4 of the best electional charts we can find for the next month, because she likes to stack up, like, and see if how her electional charts that she's picking out each month stack up against the ones we're picking out. And it's always interesting seeing different astrologers comparing and contrasting, like, what the best day they think for starting different things is in a given month.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll end up with overlaps like that. All right. Let's see. So other news before we get on to the forecast. I don't know if you guys want to go into this. I was like sick and like not paying attention to anything for weeks and was off social media. I came back and I was actually really shocked by like the surge in crazy
been a madhouse.
Conspiracy theories. Yeah, I mean, I realize that there's just news and lots of stuff happening each day, but like glancing at like Facebook was a shock because there was just a lot of crazy stuff. And Austin, when you and I talked about this, you emphasized I should be clear that I'm talking about not like mainstream light conspiracy theories, but more like extreme kind of wacky stuff about like 5G being the cause of the coronavirus and like Bill Gates trying to enslave humanity and all sorts of weird stuff that was going on. And I don't know if we get greater exposure to it because we're in the astrological community, which has sometimes more alternative type views and things, or if this is just something going around in general. But it was a very weird experience for me to come back to like not paying attention to what was going on very much, and then all of a sudden, yeah, seeing that.
Yeah, well, so a couple of things on that. I've been thinking about what's been happening in the world, like literally all of us. And one of the things I came to then this came about through a discussion with my patrons that I did 4 or 5 days ago, was that there is a great hunger to figure out what the story is right now. This set of events broke a lot of what people thought the story was, right? Like oh, we're doing this and society's doing this and we're going in this direction. And it's the events of the last 2 months have blatantly invalidated a lot of the timelines people had. And, stories are not primarily entertainment. They are literally how we set expectations and think about ourselves in the context of the world, right? Anytime you connect multiple events in a sequence with where they're, living human, or where there are conscious beings involved, it's a story, right? One story is, I expect the sun rises in the morning. If that story got disrupted, it would fuck up not only my expectations about the day, but it would also mess with all of the other stories that little unit plays a role in. And so I think I see people and myself as well, just like, so what is going on? And I think what's going on, there's a simple thing like, oh, there's a plague going on, but there's a ton of other shit happening, and trying to figure out what the shape of that is, what it means for all these different people and different layers and all of that. There's not just that is not simply a thing that we're curious about, right? This is a giant and in many ways dangerous thing on a lot of different levels, whether we're talking about physical danger from a disease, or the danger of our societies getting reshaped in a way that is very much for the worse, right? And we have highly suspicious things like the movement of trillions of dollars, like you were saying, Chris, with the Jupiter-Pluto. Boy, is there a lot of money moving around. And so I think it's really like you add that to everybody's trapped on the internet for a month, and you get all kinds of stories.
Right. I guess I just as a Scorpio, I was telling Nina in the last episode that I just recorded, which I'll actually release before this one, where we did a whole discussion on the birth chart of the United States. It's actually going to be a really great episode. I'm excited to release it probably today or tomorrow. But towards the end of it, we were trying to talk about what were the actual documented times that could have been the birth chart of the United States that were like plausible times based on whatever historical primary evidence we have, versus here are some of the weird charts, like the Gemini rising chart for the United States is set for like 2 a.m. and basically requires to work, like for some reason, some weird Freemason or like occult sort of type conspiracy in order for that to even be plausible, and doesn't really make sense then, and probably isn't plausible because the founders of the country probably were not up at 2 a.m. doing some sort of weird magical thing in order to sign the Declaration of Independence. And anyway, the point that I made towards the end of that is I'm often torn as a Scorpio stellium, as somebody who, on the one hand, is open to and interested in those occasional instances in history where you see like occult or divinatory topics being used by people in power in weird ways that have actually been documented, like Reagan using an astrologer, or Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, being found with like a Jupiter talisman or something when he died, for example. But then there's also just a lot of other instances where that stuff gets overapplied, and people, the like Scorpio function of people to dig in deep and find the truth or find the hidden truth underlying things, sometimes goes berserk or malfunctions, and people do that too much, and they try to find or uncover or sometimes invent a more elaborate conspiracy than what's actually happening, where things are often much more simple and much more straightforward than you want to believe or than you realize. That was a little bit of what I was feeling.
I will just say, Ben Franklin was, wrote an astrologically timed almanac. So, there were people in those circles
we actually talked about that in that episode, which is that's a misapprehension, because Benjamin Franklin wrote a satirical thing where he attacked astrologers, and he's sometimes mistakenly believed to have been an astrologer in modern times. But that's because there's like Facebook memes that circulate of him saying something positive about astrology, but in fact, if you read the full context, he was actually mocking like other almanac makers who actually believed in it. So that's like one of those conspiracy things where sometimes people like have a perception or believe that the founding fathers were like definitely into astrology, but we don't have as much evidence for that as like it would be nice to, ideally, as an astrologer myself.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't get that off Facebook, but no, I'd be interested to listen to the episode. I don't really like the 2 a.m. time anyway. I'm a little ride or die with the Sag rising chart.
The Sibley chart. It just
works so well.
Do you guys have strong opinions about the birth chart of the U.S.?
I probably don't have as strong an opinion as you guys.
I actually don't.
Yeah.
I just really, I think that one, it's a nation. Nations are different than human babies. And that you can have multiple charts applying and being useful for different purposes for a nation in a way that's not true as for a human baby. What I have found is that the Sag rising chart for the US is tremendously descriptive and also has a lot of predictive value.
Mm.
So, which isn't to say that no other chart can, but I have been convinced of its efficacy over the years.
Sure.
That's a beautiful point. Yeah, just, Austin, what you were saying about countries are a little bit different to people. In Australia, we have a similar thing where there's sort of two commonly used charts. One of them is the first settlement landing of Captain James Cook coming in 1788, which my dear friend and now deceased colleague Ed Tamplin was a big proponent of. But there's also the Federation chart of January 1901, when Australia achieved a level of independence, defining it as its own nation under the British Crown, but in a way that was more self-governing. And that 1901 chart works very well when you're doing timing for Australia in modern context, if you like. It was sort of the founding of the government rather than founding of the land by white settlement, if you like. So that idea of like different charts, it's very interesting.
Yeah, and just the debate over them, and sometimes astrologers coming to different conclusions based on like what their preferred chart is that seems to work better in their opinion based on whatever interpretation or timing they've done. Anyway, you guys should check out that episode. It's a good episode. My entire point, though, with this little segment was just one of the things I want to say is just that becoming an astrologer doesn't mean that you have to leave your critical thinking at the door. And I think that's kind of important, or it's something I want to remind people about in this age where a lot of crazy conspiracy theories are going around, is that it doesn't necessarily mean you subscribe to some of those things or have to, just because you're into what other people might classify as like new agey or alternative or other type of sort of thinking when it comes to astrology. And I think that's something that I've always tried to, do here on the podcast and show by, not by experience, but leading by example in terms of trying to put in research and like have good reasons and not just pull stuff out of thin air, even when you're talking about a subject that's often treated less seriously in the world in general, such as astrology. So that's my little soapbox for that. I think that's it in terms of major topics that we covered. I also did the Alan White lecture. Kelly, you never had the opportunity to meet
not.
Alan White, sadly. Austin, you did. Do you have any major memories or recollections worth sharing?
Oh, let's see. What was great about you putting out the Alan White episode is I just like taught like a 15-minute Alan White thing in my year one class, I believe. Yeah, it was in my year one class, like the day before. And so, I was telling people about Alan White, and then you came out with that. It was beautifully timed.
Nice.
I love it.
Let's see. I don't even remember what bit it was. But yeah. The septiles and reptiles and flooring tiles bit went over quite well.
Right. It was one of his like classic lines about he would be dismissive of like modern astrologers using a bunch of minor aspects. He would say everybody's using septiles and reptiles and ceiling tiles these days.
Oh my God, that's brilliant. I haven't had a chance to watch that episode yet, but I look forward to it.
And his cadence made it even better. He had this, reptiles and ceiling tiles, and it wasn't Pluto, it was Pluto. He had this sort of drill instructor quality.
Yeah, like the guy from Full Metal Jacket. And he also pronounced Libra. He called it. He said Libra. I always loved his pronunciation of Libra. So yeah, I was glad I finally released that. I was a little nervous, and I recorded a long intro because I was not trying to get flamed by my audience for any sort of somewhat gruff or like harsh comments that he made, since I might make them differently or maybe not that strongly. But I hope I didn't go too far in like saying too much stuff like that, because I wanted to still give him credit and sort of honor his memory by putting that lecture out. So that was the other thing. And the only other episode I've done this month, because I basically just did a bunch in the past week, was with Becca Tarnas once I started getting better and started being able to record episodes again. And we focused a lot in the later part of the episode on the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which obviously is something we talked about a lot extensively in the last episode. But one of the things that was cool that we did towards the end of it that I hope people stuck around the entire time for was focusing just on how, if this is the conjunction that we're going through right now, and this is setting the stage for the next 30 to 40 years, then what dates exactly are the next hard aspects, which will be extensions of that cycle? If we're setting the seeds or the foundations for the next 30 or 40 years now, either geopolitically or otherwise, When is the waxing square when Saturn squares Pluto, and when is the next opposition between Saturn and Pluto halfway through the cycle, and when eventually is the waning square and the next following conjunction that closes down and completes the cycle. And identifying some of those dates and how far in the future some of it is was really interesting to me in terms of starting to think of the long-term projections for this, in terms of us seeing the opening of a chapter that's going to last for a very long time in world history, in the same way that the conjunction in the 19 teens or 1910s opened up a period of world history that didn't end until just after World War II was over, but how you could see everything that started at the beginning of that conjunction around the opening of World War I set up history for everything that would occur over the course of the next 30 years. So that's something that was a lot of fun and was interesting. Have you looked at that, like the future cycles or long-term planetary alignments?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I spend time with. I haven't looked a lot at like the quartering of the Saturn-Pluto cycle forward from here. I've been more interested in thinking about the next 20 years of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle as a more not exactly bite-sized. 2 decades is still not bite-sized at all, but it's less, right? And also just the next 10 years has a lot of astrology. There's a lot to remark on.
Like the further you get into history, obviously the more difficult it becomes to predict, because your context, you get further and further away from the context and the trajectories that you currently know. So certainly focusing on the next 10 to 20 years is more manageable than like 40, 50 years out.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes, for example, with Saturn Pluto and or Saturn or Uranus Pluto as well, what the conjunctions and oppositions mark is usually some crazy shit that traumatizes the world and changes everything for the next 10 or 20 years. And so you can know that something like that might be due at a given time, but you don't know what you just know that something of that nature happens. Then you don't know what it is. But you do know that whatever timelines and event structures you can project up to that point will be disrupted, and then we'll go in a different direction.
Right. One of the things I didn't realize that was really solid when we were talking about the previous Saturn-Pluto conjunctions of the 20th century, where like the one that started with World War I was like really on the nose and was really close within a year of starting World War I or within a few months. Then the one that happened just after World War II, when the Cold War was really getting started, was pretty on the nose and was pretty close. The one, though, in 1981, people often treat as, well, nothing major happened during that time. But one of the things that was really interesting is 1981 was really the year that the AIDS epidemic became a full-blown thing and became fully classified and discussed, and I think officially announced by the World Health Organization at that time. And I think the parallel with this current conjunction is really interesting, where very close to this current conjunction, we have a new, health pandemic that gets officially recognized around the same time as well.
Mm-hmm. And the previous two both had big disease things as well. It was polio around the one in the late 40s, and it was what later was called the Spanish flu, but didn't come from Spain. It actually developed in the horrid health conditions of the trenches in World War I. So we have big disease for all of those. And I would say that, so the Saturn, Pluto, and Libra, it's Saturn in its graceful exaltation. And so a lot of the big power moves, because all of these are, Saturn, Pluto is always big power moves, right? The big power move then, that was when the arc of, how should we say, a lot of the corporatization of culture, which is of culture and governmental structure, et cetera, which has become normal in the United States. That's when all of that started. There's a whole lot, there are a whole lot of things that are just kind of normal now in our hyper-capitalism, late capitalism, whatever you want to call it. And all of that was getting going during the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in the early 80s.
Sure. Well, it's even just interesting with AIDS in 1981 and the sign that it took place in being Libra, and just the effect that that had on like relationships and sexual relationships and everything else. Like I've heard some older people talk about like the period between there being like this 10 or 20-year period between like the advent of birth control in like the 60s and 70s versus the extreme change that suddenly happened then in the 80s when sometimes like a sexual relationship with somebody could be like a life sentence or could result in
Could
death.
be a death sentence. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could never. There were consequences to irresponsible sexual behavior before, but they did not used to include death.
Yeah.
Sure. So it's interesting, I don't know, if you're just thinking about the sign placements, because it's something that's not focused on in, for example, like Tarnis's approach, who probably has the best approach to treating outer planet cycles. And it's the approach where everybody's rereading Cosmos and Psyche right now. And I know there's some younger astrologers doing like a book club on Cosmos and Psyche this month on Twitter, which I definitely encourage everybody to read and join. I'll see if I can put a link to that, and I may re-release my old episode that I did with Richard Tarnas on the 10th anniversary of the release of Cosmos and Psyche I did back in 2006. I don't have a video version, but I'll try to create a video version this month to release on YouTube. He focuses primarily on more of that Keplerian approach to astrology that's just aspect-based and based on planetary cycles and doesn't focus on the signs of the zodiac as much. But it's interesting maybe comparing then if the AIDS epidemic was a Pluto-Saturn conjunction in Libra, what then the contrast is with the Pluto-Saturn conjunction in Capricorn and what we're seeing now.
Yeah, I would say that, I suppose to begin, the nature of what happened during the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn is not sufficiently clear yet. We're going to need a little bit of distance. Sure. But with Saturn being in its home sign, it's just sort of blatantly Saturnian, right? Like it's plague, it's control, it's big money. It's like just all like read negative Capricorn things out of any book, and it's kind of where we're at. With the signs though, the one that happened in the late 40s following World War II was in Leo, and so the containing boundary thing that happened there was that the modern boundaries for 100 different countries were set then. Like all of these borders happened. A lot of countries were rearranged then. And so we have the sun, we have Leo, we have like, what is the exact space over which this country is sovereign? Where does that end? Right.
Yeah, I forgot about that. That many of our Pluto and Leo friends have that Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Leo in the 1940s.
Yeah.
Let's see.
My mom has that.
When was that?
Yeah, my papa. Same,
there it is.
Same.
So yeah, between like 1946, 47, and 1949-ish.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. What were you going to say, Kelly?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about that. So many things. You guys are just sharing such really deep, rich material. The Saturn-Pluto now, Austin, your point around Capricorn and like the really negative Capricorn things, there is this sort of, the Pluto is sort of intensifying and creating this extreme quality to money and power, but big money and big power, like government control or the power that a company has because they're just bigger or they have more money than anyone else. So there's this real concentration there that, when supply chains were started to be disrupted in February and March, and then through April, certain bigger companies were able to grab market share because certain smaller companies maybe couldn't meet demand or keep up. There's just been this real rearrangement with money and power that I think it will take some time. As you said, we need a bit of distance to actually see what has gone on with that, these new alliances or new concentrations of power and control having been formed.
Yeah, it rearranges the chessboard or the game board significantly. Yeah, I mean, and so just on an anecdotal level, you go out, or I've gone out, and the big box store national chain is open, but the small businesses are closed, which
Mhm.
has upsetting implications if that carries forward.
Yes.
We don't need more
Yes.
monoculture. We need
No.
more small businesses.
Yeah.
The keyword that I came up with in my episode with Becca, where we were talking about Saturn and Pluto cycles, was stress testing. Like if there are in the world in general or in the economy, if there's like cracks in it where the foundations or some part of it is unstable, like what happens when you put an extreme amount of pressure on that area, and does it hold up and does it survive that period of an extreme amount of pressure, or are the cracks serious enough that it actually reaches the breaking point and
Mm.
falls? And this being like that period where if there are cracks in society, then this stress test becomes the point where some of those powers, it becomes unstable and not sustainable.
Yeah,
So
and I think
you probably can't see it, but I literally wrote down and circled pressure testing,
Nice.
pressure test for things I wanted to talk about.
Okay.
And I have a little point about that I'd like to make, but Kelly,
yeah.
please feel free to go
Oh, I
first.
mean, I was just going to say it's sort of these weird extremes of like the big is getting bigger, but some of the smaller companies or organizations, like almost at a micro level, are able to pivot and move a little bit more quickly. There's something really weird about being on either end of the spectrum and that being a way of managing, but the people in the middle that like aren't super big but aren't small enough to change quickly, or organizations. And then the second point is about the pressure testing and the stress testing. Something like this really reveals the weaknesses in social structures and
Mhm.
government protections or lack thereof. And that's something that I think is being really revealed, is what is happening to the undersupported and the marginalized, for instance. It's devastating, and hopefully it can be revelatory and change inducing.
Right.
Well, it'll
With
be
like so many
it's
people living paycheck to paycheck, what happens if economy is shut down and everybody can't go to work for
And you
like a
don't
month
get,
or
all of a
two?
sudden you have no notice and no paycheck.
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
I would say it's revelatory, whether that's good or bad.
That's exactly
In
it.
the
Yeah.
original
Yeah.
sense of revealing or the sheet getting pulled back. So yeah, one really useful way of thinking about how things respond to big pressure and big stress comes out of the work of Nassim Taleb, who I would strongly suggest exploring. He's the person who popularized, who really he pulled it from Roman literature, but he basically coined the black swan term and did an excellent job of predicting the last economic downturn. And one of his like things to think with is in relationship to how do things respond to stress. Are they fragile, where they can't tolerate much pressure? Are they robust, where they kind of remain the same regardless of how much pressure is around? Or are they anti-fragile? Do they actually gain from being stressed? And so he
Mm.
gave as an example, there are certain qualities of the human body, such as muscles, that actually gain from
Mm.
being very strongly challenged, right? Where
Yeah.
there are other things like this mason jar that do not gain from being challenged at all. It's fragile, right? And so as just like a quick 1, 2, 3 category way of thinking about how does something respond to stress? Is this part of my life fragile, robust, or anti-fragile? Is this business fragile, robust, or anti-fragile? And he's got a bunch of lectures on YouTube and a bunch of very, very good but very dense books.
Yeah. On your recommendation, I've been following him on Twitter, and he's incredibly thought provoking and clear. I'm like, I can see why you like him. And I love that you've pointed me towards him. So that's a great tip to share with everyone.
He's also not afraid to I believe they call it shit post on Twitter about
Yeah.
abstruse mathematical probability calculations.
Yeah.
Good times. All right, guys. Shall we transition into talking about the month of May?
Sure.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. That was fun. We've reverted back to our old format that we did for many years of like catching up and
Yes.
talking about all of our stuff as we would do if we were just like three astrologers sitting around in person regularly, but we only get to do this once a month. Hopefully at some point, once things calm down, maybe, and there's less like important pressing stuff to catch up on, we'll revert back to the old format of doing the forecast first. But now that we're an hour and 11 minutes into this, why don't we jump into it? All right,
Sounds like a
so
plan.
that's the plan. All right, let me share the chart first for those watching the video version. So this is our artwork for the month made by our friend from Brazil, Paula Bellomini, who's an astrologer. And this chart is actually sort of from our yearly calendar, which shows where the planets will start in the signs of the zodiac at the beginning of the month and where they will end up by the end of the month. So it sort of shows you how fast or how slow in many instances some of the planets are going this month and what signs they'll be moving through. The other chart, of course, is from our planetary alignments calendar, which just shows primarily the conjunctions and the lunations and the planetary stations and ingresses during the course of the month of May. So there's a decent amount of stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on this month. Most of it's really concentrated to that, what do we call it? The second week, basically, with the second full week, which is between May 10th and May 16th, where we have Saturn stationing retrograde in Aquarius, Mars finally departing from Aquarius and moving into Pisces, thus completing the full Saturn-Mars conjunction.
Yes.
Venus stationing retrograde in Gemini, and Jupiter stationing retrograde conjunct Pluto in Capricorn. So it is a relatively packed month, but it's kind of weird because it's all concentrated, at least the major stuff is really concentrated over that second full week of the month.
Yeah, it's very part one and part two. There's before that week and then after that week.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
there's a lot goes down in a few days in the middle of the month.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, we've all been looking forward to this period because the two primary things, I know you mentioned, Austin, when we were preparing for this, are just the Venus retrograde and then the Mars-Saturn conjunction finally wrapping up. And those are the two big signatures that we've been looking forward to, both and identified both in the yearly forecast, but also in last month's forecast, because we were kind of expecting the Mars-Saturn conjunction and the cessation of that to coincide perhaps with some of the lessening of the restrictions that have been happening with the quarantine, or hopefully we weren't sure if that was one of the main signatures with what was going on with the coronavirus and some of the things that were peaking in general. But it's interesting how things are lining up so far here at the end of April with some of that, at least in terms of the restrictions, and Mars getting ready to depart from Aquarius in just a couple weeks now.
Yeah, I think it's going to end up timing it really well.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess
I'm
sorry,
go ahead, Kelly.
I guess the only question that we don't know that I'm nervous about is if the releasing of the restrictions, which seems like a breath of fresh air in some ways, some of the concerns are whether there'll be a second spike or second sort of peak of people getting infected with the coronavirus, and then what happens at that point. I don't know if we can call that, but it's just interesting that at least the Mars-Saturn conjunction is lessening at that point, and then what comes next after that as we head into the summer.
Yeah, well, and we know that what comes at the end of June, whatever it is not good. It might be economic, it might be medical, it might be both. But we do know that there are a lot of very difficult configurations at the end of June and early July. So
right.
As far as that's what's next. But
yeah.
That's what's after what we get to at the end of May.
We move into the period of the interim between the most tense parts of the year and the second, aside from this whole pileup of planets in Capricorn and the Mars-Saturn conjunction, which has been taking place over the past couple of months that we focused on in the yearly forecast. The other part of the year that we really focused on as being the most tense part of the year, I think, like you said, starts in June, July, when Mars moves into Aries, and we get the ramping up to the Mars retrograde in Aries that is square to the Capricorn planets.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll be fun. That's September. And
we have time.
I would say with the ISR conference being originally scheduled during that very difficult piece of astrology, that just that timing to me as an astrologer, I'm like, yeah, probably not going to happen.
Yeah, I was not going to.
Hopefully everything's great and it does work out. That's not. It's not a wish. It is a suspicion.
Yeah, I was not going to mention that because I know even before all of this last year, we had all agreed that that was not the finest piece of electional astrology, putting the opening of the conference like right on the day that Mars is stationing retrograde in Aries square Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter, everything else. But I don't know. Let's hope for the best, and we'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Doom properly placed at various points in the year, but I really like the second half of this month. I think the first part of the Venus retrograde, where Venus is square Neptune, is going to be fun. It might not be, there may be some positive expectations set, which are not met later. But as far as take it day by day, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think people are going to go nuts in, like doing all of the social things and doing all of the like going to the beach things and all that. Like it's very, Venus and Neptune doesn't help Venus find true or lasting pleasures, but Neptune can help Venus find pleasures.
Some positive expectations met that are not met later. I love what a euphemism like you're almost using here for Venus. You're being very gentle about this Venus stationing retrograde square Neptune.
I'm like, who are you and what have you done with our Austin?
All right.
I'm just trying to use structural language.
Okay. Well, you don't have like a meat grinder like analogy for Venus square Neptune.
I don't think it's a meat grinder.
No.
No.
Similarly, poetic turn of phrase for this configuration.
It might be like being abducted by the Fae, where you're taken off into a fantasy realm for a while, and then and it's really interesting. There are a lot of experiences that are kind of magical, and then you wake up in a cornfield and your wallet's missing.
Your wallet, and hopefully not your
beautiful
liver.
Because
or
I do
your dignity.
think. Oh, your dignity. There's going to be a lot of overindulgence in things, whether it's seeing people shopping, spending money. It just feels like some of the pretty shiny things that have been inaccessible for people, that they're going to not have boundaries about that.
Right. Neptune is very anti-boundary.
Yeah. It's like, I'm going to have all the things because I had no things for 2 or 3 months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was really interesting how, March's events made what the Venus retrograde was going to be about so much more clear. It's like, that makes a lot. Of course, there's going to be excessive and not necessarily responsible relating and spending, right? Or not necessarily like far-sighted. Right. There's some short-term pleasure-based decisions. And I think that the North Node, Rahu's ingress into Gemini and sharing that space with Venus is in and of itself a rather lustful and debaucherous influence. And then with the Neptune as well for the first part, you're going to have a lot of that. But I like that a lot better than this June's part of the Venus retrograde where Venus is tightly square Mars. Which is much more contentious and a lot less partying with the Fae.
Yeah. I like that acknowledgement of the North Node coming into Gemini, Austin, that the nodes change signs on May 5th, North Node into Gemini, South Node into Sag. And that's really going to amplify that Venus hunger for whether it's connection or pleasure or indulgence. And we have 2 Venus square Neptune aspects this month, one around May 3rd before Venus goes retrograde, and a second later in the month around the 20th after Venus has gone retrograde. And Venus is really just squaring Neptune through that whole period. She doesn't move much by a degree there. So there really is that feeling of like a hunger that, and with Neptune, you can't be satisfied and you don't actually know what you really want. So you just take in, or you say yes to many things, hoping one of them will satisfy you or quell the craving, quench the thirst. But it's hard to find that real sense of, oh, this was really worth waiting for.
Yeah, it's such an
Yeah.
overly idealistic aspect, putting Venus and Neptune together, especially in the hard aspects, in over idealizing something, especially something that you haven't attained yet, and thinking that it's really great. And then once you have it, sometimes that feeling of disillusionment that sometimes sets in when the reality eventually sets in. And I'm not sure if we already see the reality this month, or if a large part of this month in the second half, with Venus stationing retrograde there so closely conjunct Neptune, is still just the honeymoon phase or the illusionment phase.
Well, so let me speak on behalf of Venus Neptune. I would say that if you expect to be able to keep a lot of the experiences that gives you, it's not gonna be good. But if you just like go into experiences to have experiences, and don't expect to like be able to to have a solid whatever at the end of it, it's fine. It can actually be fun. It's good for pleasure, but it's not good for lasting gain. And I think people should be careful setting expectations around Venusian topics during that period, because it'll be very hard to see where things are going to end up. But if you don't marry yourself, if you don't marry yourself to, oh, well, we had this experience, or I'm going to go do this, and it has to be this at the end of the day. If you expect it to be what it looks like, if you expect in 2 months to be able to look back at it and be like, yep, it's still there and it's exactly what I thought, there's a much higher chance of disappointment. But if you're just doing stuff to do stuff, that's very good. Venus Neptune is fun. Also worth pointing out, it's Neptune here is in the sign of Venus's exaltation. So what fantasies Neptune can produce will be pleasing to the Venusian nature.
That's a beautiful point. So there's sort of these periods, I guess, of maybe being able to relax and let go or be at ease, even if it's not sustainable or long lasting, but certainly in the moment, having that release of perhaps tension.
And I imagine the stock market and economic predictions will probably follow that. Like, oh, everything's fine, right? Everything's great. We've got all this money. Everything's going to be great. All the stocks will soar. It's going to be fine. And like those are predictions about the future based on a delusional moment, or a moment with strong illusory potential, right? So those kind of things will almost certainly be wrong. But if you just want to like go hang out and get drunk and whatever, not expect much to come out of it except for that, then you'll probably be in good shape.
Yeah. One of the things I thought of with that Venus-Neptune vibe throughout May was this uncertainty about exactly what you can and can't do and when. So, Belgium's not every country's doing this differently, but I'm hearing information from New Zealand and Australia as well. And there's sort of this staggered rollout to do with reopening. We think we're going to have this happen on this date, and then a week or two later, these other things will happen, but we're not giving you all the detail, and we're reserving the right to change our mind right up until the last minute. So there's this hopefulness of Venus Neptune. Maybe we can get together. Maybe we can do this, but never really knowing until kind of the last moment whether it's actually going to happen or whether you're going to have that letdown or disappointment, which unfortunately is a side effect of Neptune because things aren't quite what we hope them to be.
That's a great point,
really good
Kelly.
point.
So maybe one of our keywords for Venus retrograde here is like the restructuring of social norms as people like emerge from the Mars-Saturn conjunction and the quarantine, the question of what does society look like at this point and what's appropriate socially, or how do we structure society in a post like COVID situation for the second half of the year.
Yeah. And how much do we wear masks and
inhabiting that ambivalence, right? Like, I don't know what the fuck's happening to the world. Let's take these pills, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Well,
one of the things that I think about too, just as another topic here, is given my husband's role in the education industry, there's a lot of discussion now about, because every country has different school years. Kids are in school at different times of the year. And one of the big topics are the kids going back to school? Under what circumstances? How will that be structured? Can we manage social distancing when we have a group of 5-year-old or 6-year-old kids in a classroom? So there's a lot of, and I think that's Venus sort of being in Gemini, there's sort of a bit of a theme there. Also being aware Mercury's going into Gemini this month. What does school look like? What does education? What are the young children? How are their lives going to be structured with this going forward as well?
sure. Yeah,
They've
really great.
been pretty weird. I know I have a good friend of mine has a good sized family, and I know
Tribe of
that
kids.
yeah, it's been very Saturn, Mars, Pluto. Like, so they're doing school remotely, but the school was asking him to videotape his children doing the Pledge of Allegiance and send that to the teacher because that was required, which was utterly bizarre. So
Okay.
that's some pretty Saturn Pluto. I hope that that's not a national policy, that is an eccentricity of that particular school. But we were just catching up and he's like, yeah, let me tell you about what's been going on with the kids' school. I've been having to videotape them.
Mm.
One of
And
the
that's
things,
the Saturn, Mars, Pluto. And we're moving away from that for a while, right?
right. One of the things, though, that's going to be, I feel like it's going to be connected with all of this and it gets set up immediately with that Venus station is, so here, just looking at the animate chart for those watching the video version, starting in late April, we can see Mars starts out at 20 Aquarius and Venus starts out at 18 Gemini, and Venus is slowing down and getting ready to station retrograde, and Mars is headed towards the end of Aquarius. And then what happens is weird because it's almost simultaneous, but Venus slows down and it stations retrograde right there at 21 Gemini. But then pretty much within the same day, Mars switches signs and moves into Pisces, which we know, but I think why that's relevant is because of that weird Neptune signature that's tied in with it. It means that the square with Venus and Neptune then is really heightened and is really activated at that point. So that Neptunian aspect of things and that social aspect of Venus, which is really heightened at that point, starting in the middle of May. But then that means that it's also setting off the very beginning of and the buildup to that conjunction between Mars and Neptune, then, which will eventually take place later, and the contrast between completely opposite or opposing significators hitting Neptune and how that manifests. It might be like a Venus-Neptune can sometimes be a bit more pleasant than like a Mars-Neptune conjunction, especially in different ways that it can manifest. But anyways, it starts at that point. Venus completes a second exact square with Neptune around May 20th, which is actually right around the time of the new moon, which takes place on the 22nd. But then Mars makes its way towards Neptune and then eventually conjoins it. And the moon actually catches up at the same time at 20 degrees of Pisces around June 12th. So this is taking us a little far into the future as we're starting to get into things in June, but I think that's going to be relevant in terms of whatever happens in the middle of May initiates a period where we're not going to see the full results of that until the middle of June. But it's almost like there's something positive happening that's seemingly positive in the middle of May, but then it has a seemingly sort of negative or downside that comes out by the middle of June.
Yeah, I see the same thing. I'm timing it a little bit differently. I'm more concerned with Venus and Mars's exact square, because that really takes us from Venus right in that square with Neptune, which is a mellow, if potentially illusory vibe, to Venus square Mars while Venus is retrograde and with Mars in the superior position. That puts a lot of antisocial fire into into the whatever fun was happening.
Right.
Mars.
It's
Mars
interesting
is
that
conflict.
square. It looks like that square happens like right halfway through the Venus retrograde when Venus conjoins the Sun at 13 Gemini on June 3rd, and both of them are basically squaring Mars right around that point, around June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd.
Right, that's a good point. The sun's doing that as well. So that's Martial.
There's some friction there, some tension.
Yeah, that the story will pivot there.
Yeah, it looks like that's also the full moon, or very close to the full moon of June 5th.
Which
the moon
is an eclipse?
It's
possibly
one
borderline?
Of those, it's
like on the borderline?
Yeah, it's one of those, that's one of those, like, I guess it's an eclipse.
Yeah.
But it's, pales in comparison to the one that comes 2 weeks later.
Yes, that's true. That's the one to watch. So for May then, there's a sense of like hope that maybe you can enjoy a few things, but enjoy them because they're not going to be around forever kind of thing. This may not be a permanent state of pleasantness, but enjoy the passing phase where and when you can. Is this to summarize?
I guess. Like, I don't want to be too much of a downer, but like Venus, Neptune, sometimes its most extreme manifestation is false hope. And I feel like that's one of the key words we're like dancing around here. Is obviously that's not going to be the same for everybody, but the illusory nature of Neptune is such that the optimism of Venus sometimes is not misconstrued, but misapplied, sometimes in very extreme ways. And that's not always the case. And certainly there'll be like more moderate or like light manifestations of that are even positive or good. But
well, one thing to add in that I've been mulling over is the changing sort of quality to Venus in Gemini based on what Mercury's doing.
I was just going to mention that. Thank you.
Yeah, he's moving a fair bit. We're going to have the first part of May with Venus in Gemini, Mercury in Taurus. Then we get a couple of weeks in the middle to the second part of the month where Mercury's in Gemini too. And then at the end of the month, Mercury goes into Cancer, which is its own, the start of its own retro cycle, which is something different altogether. But I do wonder about something enjoyable. I think about technically the theory says that Mercury in Gemini is going to help Venus in Gemini out in some capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I also think that it's going to, it's another factor that points to a burst of manic activity.
Hugely. I mean, and May 11 is the start of many reopening things in the countries that are managing or ready to take those steps. The frantic thing, I think, is going to be really key. There's so much information. Can we do this? We can't do that? It's going to be very mental buzz.
Right. And a lot of commerce as well.
Yes.
Speaking, though, of Mercury, that was one of the things I noticed when I was looking at the lunations this month, which is that there's a new moon that takes place at 2 degrees of Gemini around the 22nd. But what's weird is that's also around the time when Mercury, which is moving direct through Gemini and is moving very quickly,
yes.
catches up with and conjoins Venus, and it does so at 20 degrees of Gemini.
Square Neptune.
So it means that once those two significators and once the domicile lord of Venus in Gemini actually catches up with it, it happens to do so at that same, problematic and illusory degree, which happens to be exactly square Neptune, which just makes me nervous because it kind of brings me back to that last Mercury retrograde we had in Pisces, where so much of it seemed like it ended up having to do with either false information or like misinformation going around or being put out about the pandemic that was like just growing at that point and was getting serious. And that was the point where more active measures could have been taken in some of the Western countries to deal with it. But instead we were dealing with it being downplayed or saying it's not going to be a big deal or what have you, until eventually Mercury stationed direct and some of that false information sort of went away like mist that suddenly dissipated, and then suddenly the reality of the situation was right in front of everybody, and everybody had to start dealing with it at that point.
Mm-hmm. Well, and statistical models that were happening at the beginning of March, like some things have been massively revised upwards, some have been massively revised downwards. Like when we look at how the statistics were being interpreted by leading medical institutions, vastly different by the middle of April relative to the beginning of March. Like they're that whole like Mercury, Neptune, like everything looks different. Both the mainstream as well as the what everything else. But
Sure.
let me
Although
just
even at
let me
that,
give
some
up.
of the things with the projections in terms of one of the things I want to say is just that, like, in the U.S., 55,000 people have still died, and that was with the entire country being closed up and grinding to a halt, and the entire economy almost like stopping. So that was like best case scenario with all of that still happening when it did. We still lost like 55,000 people. And so some of the higher projections, obviously not the highest projections, but some of the, I just imagine if the economy hadn't stopped or if those orders hadn't been put in place, we would be talking about like hundreds of thousands of deaths just over the course of a month. I mean, that's the craziest part is of those 55,000, we're talking about most of that taking place in the span of like 4 weeks time, which is just insane to think about.
The
Yeah,
numbers are
yeah.
huge and the numbers aren't accurate yet.
Yeah. I mean, if anything, the
So
numbers are
just
probably underreported to the extent that the testing isn't as widely available as it could be or should be.
right. So
Yeah.
back to May though, if you guys don't mind.
Mercury and Gemini.
So I this is a better position for Mercury to tangle with Neptune from, right? Mercury was tangling with Neptune in February and March from its from the position of its own fall and detriment, right? So it was already in a place where it had minimal ability to sort things out. And it was also sharing that space with Neptune, which is absolutely Mercury kryptonite. Now, we do have an entanglement between Mercury and Neptune again here at the end of May, but it's the two are not in the same sign, which helps a little bit. And Mercury is in a very fit position, right? Mercury's in a position where it's very strong. And so, if we're talking about, to a certain degree, Mercury is always trying to solve Neptune, right? And Neptune is trying to dissolve Mercury. And so the last tangle they had, Mercury was super outgunned. In this next entanglement, Mercury is much better armed. And so I think if we're looking at it in terms of like trying to solve or make sense of a giant, amorphous, powerful thing, Mercury is in position to do a much better job this time than last time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Austin, because I do agree that Mercury is dealing with Neptune, but it's a very different kind of Mercury. It's like a qualitatively different creature this time round. And for me, I'm sort of thinking maybe plus or minus 3 degrees as Mercury comes into the square with Neptune and then moves to separate. So Mercury moving through about 17 to approximately 23 of Gemini. There may be some cloudiness and foggy facts then for sure. But I guess I remain hopeful that the period prior to that, certainly where Mercury is moving through Gemini in a more kind of just doing his, like, this is the first time we have Mercury in dignity since this whole palaver started. And Austin, you mentioned commerce briefly before. I'm really interested to see what happens with business and trade when Mercury gets into Gemini. It's, in addition to talking about Mars leaving the Saturn co-presence, Saturn rulership, seeing Mercury, the traditional planet of negotiation and deal making and business interaction, seeing him come into one of his home signs does make me really get curious about what's going to happen in terms of businesses coming back online, businesses now having tweaked or moved in ways that they need to. So I guess I'm seeing a little bit of productivity with the Mercury and Gemini piece.
Well, and just as like on a personal level, not necessarily like speculating about what the entire world is going to do. It's going to be, it's good Mercury. Good Mercury there with the sun and Venus. Venus is kind of ambivalent as to whether it's helpful. But like that's a burst of energy. It's like I'm probably going to try to get some writing done and get way more writing done than I normally do. Right.
Yeah, I have a couple of big writing projects, and basically that May 11th, when Mercury goes into Gemini, is like back at the desk.
Right.
I guess I just hope, thinking back to like Ellen White, I think about configurations like this where Neptune's the one in the superior position instead of Mercury. And sometimes just that question of Alan would always phrase it as like who's on top and who's topping who, so to speak.
Who's dominating who?
Right.
I remember it being phrased differently.
How do you remember? I'm not, my memory is not very good right now, or not as good. How do you
You're
recall,
fulfilling
Alan?
a Scorpio cliche there, Chris,
Okay.
with your bedroom metaphor.
It's not my metaphor.
Well, it's Alan's, and he
Yeah,
used the F
exactly.
word.
But that just being as opposed to if, let's say, if Mercury was in the opposite sign of Sagittarius, where it obviously doesn't have dignity, but it would be in the superior position overcoming Neptune. And just sometimes that difference of is Mercury winning out? Is the message winning out, or is the illusion sort of winning out? Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah.
So it's interesting and funny that we're basically just jumping to all of like the most important stuff, but we've kind of jettisoned any chronological approach to this month.
We have, and we missed something. I don't know if you guys want to just speak briefly about the full moon earlier in the month in Scorpio. I know it's not a main event, but it is the full moon this month.
Yeah, well, I was wondering if we could just back up and like quickly just go through chronologically so we don't miss anything.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so let's just back up to and quickly go through starting May 1st. One of the things I thought was interesting right away at the beginning of the month is the month actually starts with Mercury-Uranus conjunction, like right at the top of the month, with Uranus being at 6 degrees of Taurus and Mercury being at 7-ish degrees of Taurus, just coming off of that late 6-degree conjunction with Uranus. What do you think of that, Kelly?
I think there will be a new explosion in baking at that time.
Okay.
Which
very
is
baking focused.
Very,
forecast.
I think get all your good cake recipes here. No, I think there's something very much about Mercury and Taurus having to do with making things by hand or making things, whether it's cooking or gardening or carpentry or what have you. And Mercury Uranus, I think the word Austin was using before was the experimenting. So it's almost like people are maybe more willing to engage with different food or different self-care things based on this. The other thing that I'm kind of curious about that, since Venus went into Gemini, within 24 hours of that happening, I had 3 or 4 conversations with different people about beauty and skincare products and devices and things. And I'm just interested about how Mercury, being the ruler of Venus in Gemini, coming to Uranus, maybe people are doing different things there, which I know is maybe a very specific manifestation. But and then the symbolism we often talk about with Mercury Uranus is Uranus has got the megaphone. So it is a little bit more about that innovation. And I think for us as individuals, on that it's sort of April 30th, May 1st, think about the kinds of things that you're thinking about, who you're talking to, what the topic of conversations are, because it will help you get a sense of what the longer Uranus and Taurus trend has to do with for you personally.
Yeah, definitely. And also maybe like an acceleration of some of the things that we're seeing when the sun went into Taurus and has started conjoining Uranus, of that sort of push or urge for like freedom or the loosening of restrictions, and Mercury coming in and sort of heightening some of the message surrounding that in some way when it completes that conjunction with Uranus.
Yeah. There's a beautiful quote from Brené Brown in her book Rising Strong, where she says, "We're born makers. We move what we're learning from our heads to our hearts through our hands." And this to me somehow expresses the essence of Mercury and Taurus around how getting your hands physically into things can help you connect to whatever you're doing, but also be more grounded in the moment in ways that other things can't.
I think that's really beautiful, Kelly.
You guys know that there's a funny manifestation. I didn't check this out because it happened when I was sick and not paying attention to the news, but a listener, and I can't remember their name, sent me this afterwards saying that it was around the time of the Mars-Uranus square, which we had mentioned in the last forecast, that like some of the crazy conspiracy theories about 5G towers peaked, and some people in like Europe and stuff were like setting the towers on fire. And that was around, and that some of those stories came out around the time of the Mars-Uranus square, which is a really interesting, funny, not funny, but actually kind of dumb, but interesting manifestation of that transit.
Well, and that's just on a very simple structural level, like Mars square Uranus, like attacking technology.
Right. Yeah.
Like I attack your device.
Setting ablaze cell phone towers.
Boy, Chris,
God,
I'm really envious of you. I'm really envious of you having been tuned out over the last month and a half from social media. It's been terrible.
Yeah, I mean, I got glimpses of it, but I actually feel bad because that I didn't have the same quarantine experience as everybody. Like everybody else was like playing Animal Crossing, and I did get no. Well, you were baking and like exploring. I saw you and Peter
you were.
We did go walking.
You were in like literal quarantine. I would say you actually had the preeminent quarantine experience of being ill and being afraid of infecting people. That's kind of the archetype, which the rest of us only merely resembled.
Yeah, and my poor partner living on the other half of the apartment, trying to stay away from me for a month and a half, trying not to get sick as well. I did like get a Nintendo and like killed some time at one point playing Zelda and stuff, but it was not, I didn't have the same experience. So I kind of envy some of the people that will always remember the past several weeks as this very weird time, but where everybody was like jumping on Zoom calls and like having lots of internet interactions and things like that. It looked like a lot of fun.
Yeah, I had a very mixed feeling. So I feel primarily very grateful and fortunate that the source of my livelihood was not disrupted. At the same time, I did have occasional feelings of jealousy for people who just weren't going to go to work for 2 weeks when I heard about what they were doing, and I wouldn't trade places at all. But simply, how should we say, simply being grateful and knowing what is ultimately best and true did not stop my feelings of jealousy. Somebody's like, yeah, my company's going to be fine, but I don't have to go in for 3 weeks. I was like, oh motherfucker.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's just been weird and surreal. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Sure. But that's why I've gotten back to sudden explosion of podcasts, because I wanted to be putting out material during this time, but my body just wasn't there yet. So now that it's starting to get there, I'm getting back to rolling out the podcast again. All right, so let's get back to our attempt. Let's make attempt number 2 to go through
we
the
were
month
at the start of the month. We got one thing done on the chronological.
Okay, so we talked about Mercury conjunct Neptune, which we open up the month of May with. Let me just get the chart back there for the video version, and then
Mercury conjunct Uranus,
Mercury conjunct Uranus. Then it looks like Sun-Mercury conjunction on May 4th is our next big thing. So we're halfway through the Mercury cycle before we hit another Mercury retrograde station, which thankfully is not for another 44 days, it looks like. Shortly after that, as Kelly originally pointed out, I think in our notes, the nodes change signs, and the North Node shifts from Cancer into Gemini. The South Node moves from Capricorn into Sagittarius, which, as we noted earlier, is going to primarily and most importantly set us up for shifting the eclipses out of the Cancer and Capricorn axis, and soon we're going to start getting eclipses for a couple of years in the Gemini-Sagittarius axis. So make note, and this is kind of then an interesting precursor. The Venus retrograde this year acts as an interesting precursor in highlighting the Gemini part of our chart, whatever house that falls in, and the nodes switching into that sign at the same time. It's almost like setting something up or announcing that shift that's going to become more important over the next couple of years when those eclipses start taking place in those signs as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so after that, we get our first lunation of the month, which looks like it's a full moon in Scorpio, right?
It is.
So it looks like this is happening at 17 degrees of Scorpio. And so, 17 degrees of Scorpio, looks like it applies to the next planet after that the moon applies to is what, in opposition with Mercury at 20 Taurus?
And then a square to Mars. Yeah, Mercury first.
Yeah, I'm glad Mercury's there to provide a little bit of a boundary, because otherwise the moon's like in a Scorpio, Mars-ruled sign, and then applying to a square with Mars. And I think we could do with some lunations that don't have that tension for a little while.
That'd be nice.
All right. Anything else about that full moon? Anything you guys want to mention? A lot of people wrote in and liked the anecdote last month about and sort of confirmed like hospitals or bars or other places often having like a frenetic energy or a peak in activity just anecdotally around the time of full moons. And I thought that was interesting hearing different people write in about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, the basic symbolism could be a lot more deep or intense emotions, that weirdness between the illumination, bringing to light quality of the moon in a place that deals with things that can be very private or kept close to the chest. And I did see that kind of square to Mars. I'm like, oh, it's not the first aspect, but it's certainly, it's not a 15 or 20 degree orb aspect. The moon's going to get to Mars in relatively, quick succession. So it does feel a bit like deeper emotions surfacing in a way where there is some tension or discord or there is some disagreement. There's a little bit of emotional discomfort here where it's intense and it's a release point. Given that many people have maybe been holding on to a lot of stuff or just coping in situations that are more pressured than usual, it just feels like a lot coming up and a lot that needs to either be processed or released.
Sure.
Yeah, and there's that moon's configured to a lot of planets, right? We have
Busy.
We have a sign-based square to Mars. We've got a sign-based sextile to Jupiter. We've got an opposition to Mercury. We've got a trine to Neptune. So there are a lot of different, competing features here. It is not, how should we say? It is not clearly focused on one thing. I think you're probably right, Kelly. It's a lot of like feelings coming up about a lot of things because a lot of things have happened. And all those have implications for a future which is, more difficult to see than it was 3 months ago for most people.
Yeah.
I guess like usual, we have to tie this full moon into the new moon that preceded it, which was that new moon conjunct Uranus and some of the feelings of wanting to loosen restrictions or seek liberation or approach things in a new and unique or revolutionary way. Some of those initial impulses in moving towards that probably first fully come to light in people's lives at this time, 2 weeks later, once we hit the full moon in Scorpio opposite to that.
That's a good point. I bet that some of this is on a collective level is going to be like people kind of getting ready to leave quarantine like the next week or whatever, like making that trend, this lunation spotlighting that transition, especially on an emotional level. Like, okay, so I'm not just staying in my house and playing Animal Crossing or worrying about my financial future or any of the 100 things people have been doing. Like, I'm going to go back out into the world again. And I have a lot of feelings about that.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of the increased communication, we see the first opposition with Mercury, then the trine with Neptune, but then eventually also the square with Mars, followed by a sextile with Jupiter. So just speaking to your point, Austin, about there being so many aspects and so many things the moon then encounters once it moves into that new phase.
Yeah, there's just a lot, right, that bears upon that moon.
And that moon will make all those aspects that you just listed, Chris, within a 24-hour period. So it does make it a level of busyness. On the anecdotal increase in activity from the full moon we talked about last month, as an astrologer, I've also noticed that there's a higher demand or request for people wanting consults around the time of the full moon as well. So something about this full moon being in Scorpio just feels like people might want to go a little bit deeper with their own personal reflection or personal healing experiences as well.
Okay. All right. So that brings us to then, I believe, the next major thing we need to mention is that basically takes us into that second week where all of the most important stuff happens or starts happening. And the first thing that happens is on the 10th. Well, there's two things that happen simultaneously, but the big one is that Saturn slows down and stations retrograde at 1 degree and 57 minutes of Aquarius. So this is the very first station of Saturn in Aquarius since it moved into that sign very recently, just like a month or so ago. And so we get the first, let's say one of the keywords for a station, especially an outer planet station, is an intensification of the energies of that planet. So I think this is interesting because on the one hand, I don't know, I talked a little bit about this, and it's interesting last month thinking about how this whole thing that's happening right now is either the book end of the later phases of the Saturn return of those with Saturn in Capricorn, and this is what's like capping off their transition into adulthood, or this is just the beginning phases of the Saturn return for those with Saturn in Aquarius, and the very initial sort of shot or sort of chapter of that journey for them over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. But here we get a really important turning point within that for just about not just the Saturn return people, but also with Saturn just having moved into a new sign and potentially a new whole sign house for everybody.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the Saturn sort of dipping its toe into Aquarius has been very much been a preview period for everybody about what Saturn in Aquarius is going to be like. Most impactful generally for those who have Saturn in Aquarius. When I think back to my Saturn return, mine had the same staggered ending. I'm Saturn in Virgo. And so Saturn moved into Libra for like 6 months and then came back into Virgo. And to me, it felt like my Saturn return was over. There was reprieve. And then as soon as Saturn got back into the natal sign, so in this case, it would be Saturn moving back into Capricorn, it was like, and one more round, right? Like, no, you're not done yet. Right. It was actually, it felt like it was over when it had moved into the next sign. And so the contrary will
that's
be
a good
true.
point. So you're not done yet for
Go
the
ahead.
Saturn and Capricorn people is part of the message. And this is where Saturn turns and starts heading back towards that to make sure whatever the point was that you got it over the next 6 months in basically the second half of 2020.
Yeah. Kelly, did you have that experience with your return?
I was just trying to make me sound old. I'm like, that was what, 2010 that Saturn came? No, not that late.
It was.
Hang on.
It was 2009.
Was it 2010?
It was the fall of 2009 when Saturn ingressed into Libra, and then it came back into
That
into
early
Virgo for a
part
little
of
bit in 2010.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, I had recently moved to Canada, which I did as part of my Saturn return, just for shits and giggles. And
Just for
so there was
vacation.
a lot just for
sightseeing.
blowing your life up for sightseeing. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I wanted to really understand the meaning of the word cold. So I
Right.
went to the coldest country in the world.
That
So
is a great Saturn manifestation.
honestly, and based on being with my husband, I've lived in places with really extreme climate. And you don't read that in the books about Saturn relationship stuff. But anyway, so I don't have a lot of specifics there. I apologize, Austin. That's a very long-winded way of getting to your question.
Yeah, no worries. Just curious.
It's one of the things that makes 2020 just that year of like straddling things is, Saturn is just dipping his toes into Aquarius for a bit, but he's not done with Capricorn yet. The image that I've been describing of like this Saturn going into Aquarius is like you open a door to a room and you think you're ready to go into the room or the space, and then you realize there's a fair bit of shit you're going to have to organize in there. And Saturn going retrograde is sort of the proverbial just taking that step back. I know what this is, but it's not the time to go fully into this space yet.
Yeah, there's something I forgot in the other room that I need to go back and get.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's
No,
I'm
it's
not
a
saying
metaphor.
literally.
You did that so well, Chris.
No, but I'm saying metaphorically.
That's exactly the metaphor. That's exactly. Sorry, your deadpan dryness got me there.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Like, oh, I thought I was ready, but yeah, there's something. Oh my God, completely. That's
Well,
it.
So
Perfect.
everybody could think
The-
about what house, especially what whole sign house Capricorn represents, and think about Saturn forgetting something and needing to go back into that other room to grab it before it can fully move back into Aquarius permanently for the next 2.5, 3 years.
Yeah, but Saturn's not going back to grab something. He's like, there's a wall that I need to move or something.
Right.
I tend to think of it as like some sort of building inspector. Like Saturn left Capricorn, Capricorn has had a rather thorough inspection, and Saturn's like, I'm gonna leave, and then 3 months later, I'm gonna be back to see if you made the renovations necessary to bring this up to code.
To code.
Where
I like it.
Yeah, and there will be fines if it is not up to code.
There will be consequences if you have not put the effort in.
Sure.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, at least here with the Saturn station, I think we can also say if this is an intensification of Saturn, if it's the very first station in Aquarius, if you didn't already start to see some of the themes that are going to be happening in your life with Saturn's ingress, with it first moving into Aquarius at the end of March, then this station and the events surrounding it may give you a much clearer preview of what Saturn in Aquarius is going to be about for the next 2.5 to 3 years. Just due to that intensifying effect that can sometimes come with stations.
And one little aspect that I think is just going to help with clarification around this Saturn in Aquarius is that the very next day, Mercury and Gemini will make a trine to Saturn in Aquarius. And it's not like a life-changing aspect. It's just a quick little trine from Mercury, but it's almost like you're going to get some information, a piece of insight, or maybe just this sense of internal clarification about that Saturn in Aquarius.
Look, it looks like the moon catches up to Saturn and conjoins at the same time.
Yeah, it's just
that's
a nice
really
little
nice point
ping.
of clarification. That's beautiful.
Wow.
You just get something that helps you go, that's what that's going to be about.
That's cool. All right. So Saturn
and then
retrogrades. Then we, of course, get to the more intense sort of phase of everything, where by the 13th, Venus stations retrograde at 21 Gemini, as we already discussed extensively. Mars simultaneously moves from Aquarius into Pisces, so it completes its, what has it been, like 2 months by that point, trip through Aquarius?
6 weeks in Aquarius. Yeah.
6 weeks, okay.
12 weeks with Saturn.
Okay. Yeah, 12, right, because we had that accidental extended co-presence or sign-based conjunction because Saturn happened to switch signs and move from Capricorn into Aquarius right around the same time that Mars did. So we ended up with like a huge extended period of Mars-Saturn in the same sign, which finally comes to an end at this point. And this is the final end of the Mars-Saturn conjunction and some of the lessening of the restrictions or the restricted actions as a very simple keyword for Mars-Saturn that might be indicated by that, curtailed actions.
Yeah, frustrated or frustration and thwarted will.
And then simultaneously, weirdly, right around the same time, we get the other aspect, which I mentioned at the very top of this episode or sometime earlier, which is Jupiter stations retrograde at 27 degrees of Capricorn, also around May 13th, May 14th, and it is closely conjunct Pluto, which is at 24 degrees of Capricorn. So one of the things I mentioned in terms of that earlier, Austin, we mentioned the major shifting of like huge amounts of money that is taking place at this time in the world in general, in things massively either going down or massively going up. And one of the things that was interesting that I noticed when I was just happened to be preparing for this episode is I did, for some reason, I don't know why, I guess I've used him as a chart example before. I think I used him as a chart example in my book because we have a time chart, but we have the birth chart of Bill Gates, and it's interesting that he has Cancer rising and a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in Leo in the second whole sign house in the place of finances and wealth, and at various points is or was the one of the richest people in the world. So it's interesting to see that sort of aspect in the chart of like a mega billionaire, and seeing a similar sort of signature going on. I think that might give us some idea of the signature that's going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, Jupiter-Pluto is, it won't make you super rich by itself, but a lot of the richest people in the world have that. Warren Buffett has it in Cancer. Carlos Slim has it in Virgo. It does other things, but one of the things it does is big money.
Yeah.
And it is really interesting to see huge moves money wise right now. I mean, like what was the initial bailout package? Like $2 trillion. Like that is a very large sum to move all at once.
Right. And that was just the first bailout package in the US, and they're already in the process of talking about or negotiating like a second one.
Yeah.
So here's the chart of Warren Buffett, since you just mentioned it. So August 30th, 1930.
Do we have a birth time for him?
I don't know. It says 3 p.m. Let me check the source.
Oh, and if that time's correct, that Jupiter-Pluto's in the 8th house. Wow.
Yeah, I can't tell. This sounds like somebody claims to have gotten it from a friend of his from Buffett himself, but they're anonymous, so who knows if it's accurate or not. But we do at least know that he does have a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, which is very similar to Gates.
Yes. Yeah. You're talking about the bailouts there. Virgin, the airline company, they have a Virgin Australia iteration, and they're asking from the Australian government for a $1.4 billion bailout to keep their company kind of up and running. So I know that the government is governments around the world are offering support and relief offerings to their citizens, but there's also the businesses that are, either have gone from extremely lucrative high cash turnover businesses to nothing, and then also some of them are looking for some support too.
Right. And you mentioned last month, Kelly, and I wasn't trying to dismiss it, but you made a point about Jupiter in Capricorn and Jupiter not doing so well lately, and how hard the travel industry and the airline industry is being hit by all of this, which is actually, in retrospect, actually a really good point. And I was meant to say that because I think I said something at the time, like everything's like, falling apart or not doing well right now. But you're right that area of the travel industry, which we might associate, or the airline industry in particular, that's not doing so well, that we might especially associate with Jupiter, is in particular not in good shape.
Yeah. Look, there was a lot to talk about last month, and I know we all have a lot of ideas. We don't always get to flesh out every single one of them.
Right.
But
when we do, we end up with episodes like this when we're like
which are going to be
half out,
3
2 hours and 8
long.
minutes. Yeah, and we're only halfway through the month.
Yeah. The just quickly on the Jupiter piece, I guess I was thinking a lot about the various ways Jupiter got slammed in terms of its aspect configurations, and the two industries that I could see, and maybe it's a little bit of personal bias, but I could see so much unraveling in the travel industry and in the education industries. If you think about what's happened to school education, I know university level education has had an impact as well, so you could certainly factor that in. But those two industries are classically Jupiter, and they've had the ground pulled out from underneath them. The way teachers are having to try and teach a group of 5-year-olds on the internet, these things are not sustainable. They're definitely temporary. It's phenomenal how much has changed. And, we've just had some photographs come out of Australia today where, airlines have grounded their whole fleets. This is billions and billions of lost revenue. And the planes themselves are hugely expensive. There's just 100 of them parked on a runway. And it's just phenomenal to me how different that is compared to these things.
They don't own those planes, right? Those planes are
that's true. They've got leases and payment plans.
Exactly. They're $80 million loans each. And so
right. And the questions of how do you do social distancing in a plane where everybody's crammed in a small tube that's airtight and flying for hours? You can't really effectively social distance like that.
Yeah, with
recycled air.
Recycled air. I would add to that. So one, in doing the Vedic program with Freedom Cole the last couple of years, One of the significations for Jupiter that I hadn't encountered before that I thought was really interesting was that Jupiter was relevant whenever you were going to get a bunch of people together for a big event. The Jupiter was Jupiter would tell you about the space necessary to hold a bunch of people, and also the cohesive spirit necessary to get a whole bunch of people to do one thing. And seeing Jupiter just get smashed this year, I saw that very literally, like, oh, well, you just can't get a bunch of people together. So I just wanted to add that because I thought that was very simple, but
That's
very dead
a
on.
brilliant point, Austin. And this is one of the things that makes me very dubious about any type of large gathering thing happening over the next few months, is that when you look at some of the virologists and the medical personnel, while governments are willing to allow people to go back to work, there's a level of safety and control. One of the last things that I think is going to come back is large group gatherings. And
I agree.
I think if the astrologer in me is like, well, that has to wait till Jupiter goes into Aquarius, unfortunately.
And
Yes,
even
and
then,
that-
it's under pressure.
Still, yes.
Go ahead, Chris.
That brings up a point I was just going to make, which is something I noticed in preparation for this episode, which is one of the other things it's easy to overlook, but it's actually really notable. When Jupiter stations retrograde at this point at 27 degrees of Capricorn, it gets the closest that it's going to get to the conjunction with Saturn at this point in time. But by stationing, it actually doesn't reach or sort of aborts the conjunction, basically. And so it's almost like there's something that almost happens in the aligning of the two biggest planets in our solar system in May that it gets very close to happening, but they're just a few degrees away. They're 4 or 5 degrees away, and then they retrograde apart, and the distance between them gradually increases over the course of the next several weeks or the next few months. But then eventually in December, they will come together and form that conjunction in early Aquarius. So it's almost like there's something that almost happens, like a rejoining or removing together of, not removing, a reuniting that almost comes back together this month, but then it doesn't. And it takes another 6 months before we fully see that manifest.
That's a really good point. It's as close as we get to the Great Conjunction before it actually happens.
Yeah, but maybe it has to do with something like that, like the inability, even the desire, but then suddenly the realization of the restrictions lessening, perhaps, as a result of the Mars-Saturn conjunction, finally leaving, but then the realization that life isn't fully back to normal, that we're not just all going to be able to like crowd into sports or arenas or something like that again, but instead there's still this period of awkwardness of getting used to whatever the new reality is for the next 6 months. But I don't know, eventually Jupiter does catch up with Saturn in December, and perhaps, I know with some of the projections, they were saying it would take at least a year to come up with like a vaccine for COVID. So perhaps the conjunction has to do perhaps with finally coming up with something that could help to make it so people could do things like that again, like getting in large groups.
Yeah, well, one simple but useful way that I think about the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that every 20 years is that they remake the world together. And their conjunction sets a tone for 20 or 200 years. And so like them getting as close as they can or as close as they're going to before they do the actual conjunction in December, it's like, this is part of what the new world is going to look like, but you're not actually going to see what it looks like until we get to the conjunction in December. And then I had one anecdote that I wanted to share that's thoroughly astrological about this, about the like getting together for sports. So as you all know, I'm a big fan of mixed martial arts. And mixed martial arts is in a different category than most sports because it's not a team sport, right? You just need two people in a cage to fight.
Yeah.
And so they've been, and the president of, the president of the UFC, which is the biggest organization, is a rather cantankerous fellow named Dana White. And Dana's been like, fuck it. He's like, I got a secret island. We're going to have fights with no crowds on Fight Island. And somebody pointed out to me that was the most Saturn Mars conjoined in Aquarius thing ever. Is we've got a crazy secret island where there will be fights, and he wouldn't reveal its location. He'd be like, I can't tell you where it is.
Yeah.
But they're actually they're going to be the first big sports thing to happen. There's a huge card on May 9th, and they're going to do it without a crowd. And they've got a huge testing protocol. But it's going to be fights with no audience, which is kind of eerie, and it's appropriately plague creepy. But to be fair, a lot of fans, including myself, are kind of excited that there'll be no crowd noise. There'll just be like the silence of two people locked in combat and the occasional
I mean, it won't be completely silent though, will it? It will be the sounds of pounding.
Well,
I mean punches.
I wasn't even going there, Kelly. It will be the sounds of attempted violence.
Attempted violence.
This is a family show, you two, just to remind you.
Sorry.
Take it to Fight Island. Get out of here with that.
Take it to Fight Island. I love it.
All right.
What we're sort of alluding to and jumping around with here is that the Mars-Saturn stuff is a shorter piece of a longer Jupiter-Saturn thing, basically. Mm-hmm. And that we get some of our freedoms, if you like, back in this month of May, essentially. But Jupiter and Saturn are still doing their thing. So some of the larger, I don't think international borders are opening up anytime soon. So there are pieces that are not opened up yet, but there are some smaller levels that come back. Like Austin, you can go back to watching people kick the shit out of each other, for instance, just in a different environment.
That's a great point, though. That's the other Jupiter side of this, just to continue expanding your whole point about Jupiter not being in great shape this year, Kelly, which you mentioned travel and education. And then finally, the very last other major and always traditional Jupiter theme is just international relations and relations between foreign countries, not just travel to foreign country, but also just international relations in general, and the tensions
trade
and closing off that's occurred as a result of all of this. So therefore the sort of separation that's occurred.
Yeah, and it's very separate. Countries that normally, Australia and New Zealand, have an open border situation in the same way that Canada and America. If you're a Canadian, coming into America is very different from any other person from any other country coming into the US. So there are, country agreements where there's normally very free-flowing movement of citizens, and they've all shut them. I mean, the US-Canada border has been effectively closed, I think, coming on 6 weeks or something now, which is the longest land border in the world. And to have that kind of shut, these things are significant.
Right.
Yeah,
definitely. All right. So let's get out of finally that second week of May, and let's get into the third and fourth and final weeks and start to get towards the end of this.
If you look at the number of astrological things that happened in the first 2 weeks of May, we've got about half as many things going on in the second 2 weeks of May.
Okay, so is the next major thing, is it the sun's ingress into Gemini, which it always does around
20th.
May 20th, and then shortly after that we have our second lunation of the month, which is that new moon at 2 degrees of Gemini that we mentioned earlier. Correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, once we get there, I mean, everything's in Gemini. This is that manic burst period in full bloom.
Okay. And this one, we talked more about the Venus Mercury conjunction that's simultaneously square Neptune when we've touched on this earlier, but the other part we didn't touch on is this is a full-on Mars touched lunation, because the sun and moon conjoin at 2 degrees of Gemini, but then the very next aspect that's made immediately after that is the moon applies to a square with Mars, which is at 6 degrees of Pisces at that point. So that raises the level of tension and sort of anger and angst and sort of problematic or not decisive necessarily, but separative or separating types of energies that one might expect from a lunation are much more heightened than normal.
Yeah, like the
I
boat
mean,
is rocking.
well, yeah, I mean, how should I say, Mars definitely adds a contentious piece.
Right,
It
contentious, that's
is
the word I was looking for.
it's gonna be in the context of Mercury and Venus and the Sun and Moon, and the North Node all in Gemini, right? So it's going to be Mars is going to be like throwing a little, contentiousness, a little. Mars will add a little ugly fire to a situation, but it's not the only. It's not the only planet with input. That Moon Saturn, or excuse me, Moon Sun Moon is also very tightly trine Saturn, and then with all those co-presences, it's kind of a lot again. It's different. It's a very different version of a lot than the earlier full moon in Scorpio, but it's still a lot. Like there are a lot of things going on, good, bad, and other.
Yeah, maybe the contentiousness is connected with or arises out of the sort of misunderstanding or the illusion that's being brought on or indicated by the Mercury-Venus conjunction square Neptune, because we've already talked about there being something illusory, or Mercury square Neptune can sometimes be a illusion or even a misunderstanding or a lie, and something that comes out of that which causes contention or vice versa.
Yeah, I think that'll definitely be part of it. Another way to put it might be that with Neptune is the dream. Like it's the mystery, it's the dream. And in Pisces with Mars, I think that's like fighting over to dovetail back to what I was saying at the beginning, fighting over what the story is. Right? Like, people don't feel neutrally about what's happening,
Yes.
nor should they. And there's a lot of like, no, I think this is what's really going on. No, I think this is what's going on. And there are a lot of different stories, and a lot of them are mutually exclusive. So I would expect the story wars. Somebody in the comments said story wars. I would expect the story wars to be vociferous around this time,
or the blame wars, because sometimes some of the things that are coming up are like blame and attempting to push blame on different parties or people looking for somebody to blame for what's going on. And
stories need villains.
Yes,
right.
You got to have a goodie and a baddie. Yeah.
So then the question is like, is it being correctly identified, or is something being, or someone being scapegoated? Would be a question that I would have, seeing something like that, seeing a tense lunation tied into Mars and the contentiousness of that, with a simultaneous, with the ruler of the lunation being simultaneously square Neptune. So,
yeah, I mean, I think we'll get all sorts of varieties of, figuring out stories that match the facts, fighting over. Yeah, I don't think I don't think we get like one. I think the event is story wars. I don't think that there will be one dominant narrative which takes hold. I think it will be the very opposite of that. It'll be like a gladiatorial match with 20 different contestants.
I guess something to be, maybe I should state just to be clear, is that while sometimes events happen around the time of something like this, since it's a new moon, it may be something that's initiated at that time that doesn't grow and develop and become fully clear until 2 weeks later when you have the new moon in Sagittarius. So it may be the start of something that grows after that point. And that was such an important distinction, I think, that we all learned from the Saturn-Pluto conjunction earlier this year in January. Is, remember, it's like back during that time, around the time that the Saturn-Pluto conjunction went exact, around the second week of January, there was like a couple things happening in the news where it was like the Australian wildfires were happening, and the US like assassinated a Iranian dictator, and all of a sudden everyone was very tense about whether World War III was about to start. But other than that, it wasn't like there wasn't other major stuff going on, and there was even some astrologers. I remember some astrologer writing a series about how Pluto's not important, and the Saturn-Pluto conjunction was overhyped during that time, and was being very vocal about that. But what we now know in retrospect, a few months later, is at that time, a little piece of news that kind of flew under the radar is that the World Health Organization announced that there was this new virus that had just been identified, and they announced that it was something to pay attention to and was growing and spreading very rapidly and would eventually become a worldwide thing. So maybe we already mentioned this on the past episode, but it was just a very striking lesson or reminder for me that sometimes the astrology indicates things that are starting and developing, but you may not be fully aware of it yet, and you may not fully understand the significance of it until sometime later in retrospect.
Yeah, well, and that's triply true with the lunations around that time, which were eclipses, which are often given much longer durations for their expected unpacking.
Yeah,
and more of a strong quality of things being obscured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
yeah, but also
what is born in shadow, right?
For any planetary cycle, but sometimes especially a conjunction, as representing symbolically the start of something or the start of a new cycle with respect to the properties or archetypal qualities of those two planets. But it's like sometimes you have a really long cycle that takes a while to fully develop because it's indicating something that's massive or has a lot of moving pieces, like a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. But other times, like this month, you have a smaller cycle that's more self-contained, that's going to just be indicating things happening over the course of a month, a lunar month, with the sun and moon conjoining in early Gemini, and then the full moon indicating a sort of culmination or coming into visibility, and then eventually over the next 2 weeks, that closing down in preparation for the next lunation. So some cycles are just smaller, and you see the manifestation quickly because it has a shorter timeline or a shorter life cycle.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the other ways that I can't help but think about that new moon in Gemini is just this extreme concentration in Gemini. So for each of us, the Gemini house in our chart has got this almost weird, like there's a new moon, which is under tension from Mars, but there's that restlessness of like, I want to move forward, I want to take steps, and maybe having to deal with tension around doing that. But at the same time, Venus is retrograde there, and there's that sort of call to review or go back over material or topics from the past. So it's this weird tension between a little bit of a push or this idea of trying to look forward with this call of having to reflect or to go back over things that, you know, from the recent or old past.
I absolutely agree. And I think we can fold that into earlier delineations very easily, where it's everybody's like, so what the fuck just happened? Right?
Yeah.
Since February? What's going on?
What are we living in right now?
Right? People meeting at a bar for the first time in a couple months being like, so what the fuck do you guys think is happening? Where's this going? How long is this going to last? What does this mean about the economy? What does this mean about, we can, as I think the length of this podcast has demonstrated, it's very easy to talk about this for a very long time because there are a lot of questions and their answers are not trivial.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. So back to the animate chart. We got the new moon, which is our second lunation around the 22nd. Then what are the last things as we're heading out? I mean, I know Mercury moves into Cancer and departs from Gemini.
Kind of the last... Oh, and Mercury will go, just before it goes into Cancer, it will pass over the North Node in Gemini, but they're the last couple of things.
Okay, and then it moves into Cancer, and that happens on the 28th of May?
Yeah.
Is that really it? Like, I'm not sure if we're overlooking something or if we've actually
there are no other ingresses or planetary aspects after that to the end of the month. There might be a little moon thing here or there. Austin, are we missing anything?
I don't think so. I mean, we've spent a lot of time on this. I mean, the big stuff is Mars moves into Pisces, which ends the co-presence. Venus goes retrograde. And then, there are things that add and detract from that. But there really is this kind of relatively simple bifurcation into, beginning of the month before that stuff's happened, and then
Yeah.
in the middle of the month that happens, and then that's the second half.
May
Yeah.
13 is the mood shift date.
I guess the point to emphasize is just that all of that stuff starts or ends in some instances in that second week of May between the 10th and the 16th, but so much of what starts then is then in effect for the rest of the month. So it's not that there's nothing
Yep.
happening in the later part of May. It's just that all of the crucial stuff started at that point and then will continue for the rest of the month, in some instances leading it all the way into June. So the Venus retrograde, Jupiter stationing, Mars going into Pisces, Saturn stationing retrograde in Aquarius, and now heading back to Capricorn. All of that's stuff that's then going to be in effect for the rest of the month.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so there's a mood change, there's a shift in focus and priorities. There are changes around plans and projects that were moving forward that are now moving backwards. There are things that have been very stagnant and stuck that all of a sudden start to be less stagnant and less stuck. So when we're doing this sort of brief summary, I really look at that 4-day period from May 11 to May 14, where everything just spins and turns, and the way you're facing after that period is different. So there are new things that you move forward into that just weren't available before then.
Yeah, it's a real gear shift.
Total gear shift.
Brilliant. All right, guys. Well, we're at about 2.5 hours, so I think we're getting towards the end of this episode, and I think we've pretty comprehensively covered most of the major points of the astrology of May that we meant to touch on. Of course, people should go back and check out our entire year ahead forecast, where we actually all got together here in Denver back in November, and we outlined sort of very broad strokes forecast for the entire year of 2020 if they're looking for more information about what's coming up in the future from a big picture perspective. But in terms of the details, I think we've covered May pretty thoroughly, and we'll have to wait a few weeks and get back together again to discuss June next month.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, so Chris, what would be the most auspicious moment
Yes.
to begin an
you're right.
important project this month?
Yes.
I'm dying to know.
That's so funny that you mentioned that, because I completely forgot to introduce the auspicious election for this month. And part of the reason for that is it's actually a really tough month, similar to last month, for electional charts. Lisa spent a lot of time on it. Lisa Scheim, our in-house electional astrologer extraordinaire, spent a lot of time on it this month and had a really hard time finding charts, but did eventually find one that we wanted to highlight for this month. And it actually takes place on May 2nd, 2020, around 9:30 in the morning with Cancer rising. So for the video version, people, let me pull up that chart. All right, so May 2nd, around 9:30 in the morning with Cancer rising. Thanks for reminding me of that, Austin.
Yeah, no worries.
My brain is still not fully working. All right, so we've got Cancer rising in this chart. Part of the purpose of that is to make Jupiter one of the only angular planets. So Jupiter's angular in the 7th whole sign house, 27 degrees of Capricorn in a day chart. The ruler of the ascendant is the moon, which is in Virgo, and the moon is not receiving any hard aspects from Mars and Saturn, which is part of what we're going for here. But instead, it's actually in the 3rd whole sign house, and it's applying to a trine with Uranus and a trine with Mercury, with reception, which is its domicile lord, which are up in the 11th whole sign house. So this is a pretty good 3rd house election for things like communication, perhaps teaching, and other 3rd house topics. Since the moon's in Virgo, it might be a good Virgo election for earthy type things, or work that involves attention to detail and other Virgo type keywords like minding the details and other small things. Let's see, it's not a great chart for 8th house matters because Mars and Saturn are both in the 8th house. And so matters involving shared resources, other people's money, or the partner's financial assets may not be very good in this chart. But otherwise, it's relatively decent for 3rd house topics with the ruler of the ascendant in the 3rd. Do you guys have any comments about this chart or about what you might use a Virgo-focused election for?
I mean, this screams editing to me. Going back over
Editing.
something that needs to be reworked or polished.
Yes, Virgos are the expert editors of the zodiac. I always make sure I have a Virgo handy, as many people know, for editing, like on my book, or have somebody with heavy Virgo placements handy for book editing because they're just masters of that.
Yeah, it could be a little bit of like scheduling or planning. I think about, Moon in the third is just a really nice placement for using the mind. Could be a bit overactive because sometimes Moon in Virgo, but if you've got to do a lot of thinking or writing, or you've got a lot of paperwork to plow through, for people who still have paperwork.
Yeah, it's got some nice sort of, obviously there's sort of complications, but it's got not just third house vibes, but good seventh house and 11th house vibes to some extent as well. With Jupiter in the seventh house of partnership and Mercury and the Sun and Uranus forming a trine with the Moon in the 11th house of friendship. So we did set the time on this in order to try to mitigate Venus, because we don't really like having to put Venus and to relegate her to the 12th house. So in our location in Denver, we adjusted it. So we just put Cancer rising, and then we tried to put the degree of the midheaven as closely configured to or squaring Venus as we could. Obviously, by doing that, it gets it pretty close to Neptune, since that Venus-Neptune square that's happening all month is unavoidable. But at least by putting the midheaven square Venus, we sort of mitigate it so that it's not as poorly placed in the 12th house as it could be, and it will instead have some constructive manifestation. But like I said, we were really struggling to find good charts this month, and I guess after this whole discussion of some of the tensions and things going on, we kind of understand a little bit better why that is now. But we did find 3 other electional charts, which are available in the Auspicious Elections podcast for patrons of the Astrology Podcast on the $5 plus tiers. So I just released that yesterday. So if you want access to that, you can find out more information at patreon.com/the Astrology Podcast, I believe, or maybe it's just Astrology Podcast. All right. Yeah, thanks guys. This was a lot of fun. What do you have coming up? Kelly, I know you just got done doing webinars this week, all weekend. Do you have more stuff like that coming up?
I have a couple of weekends off, and then I have more stuff.
I guess the biggest thing we do just remind people of is both of you are speaking at NORWAC.
Yes.
Caitlin Coppock is also speaking at NORWAC. Lisa Shimes also.
Lisa
basically
is
everybody.
As well. Yeah.
Yeah, basically everybody's speaking at NORWAC. It's going to be a ton of amazing lectures, and it's actually a unique opportunity because most people who, if you wouldn't have been able to attend otherwise because it's so expensive to buy like flights plus a hotel plus food plus take off work, suddenly you have an opportunity to attend sort of a world-class astrology conference from home. So it's kind of a nice opportunity.
Yeah, there were a couple of comments about that in the chat earlier that for as many of us that are disappointed we can't be there in person, there are just as many people who are excited that they can now at least connect into and participate with the NORWAC experience because they couldn't have taken the time or the money to fly across the country. And as you said, Chris, all the extra costs. There's a difference between just paying your registration money versus having all the extras on top of it. So,
right.
And then you also have the 2-week period to take in all the lectures as well, which means even if you can't give a whole weekend, you can see what you can on the live broadcast and then just, watch a couple a day for the few weeks after.
Right, because that's always the most annoying thing for me once you actually get there in person is there'll be 5 or 6 or 7 lectures going at the same time and you have to pick one of them to sit in on. And sometimes it means like picking between like 5 great lectures, but here you can actually attend all of them.
Yeah, like if I have to pick between Lisa and Austin, that's really hard, but now I can actually get both.
Right. Yeah. I can't say who I would choose in that instance, but it would be a tough.
The choices at this event are even more compounded because I have to choose between Caitlin and Austin or Caitlin and Lisa at this instance as well.
That's actually funny. Were there original conflicts about? Did you guys had you prepared your schedules for which ones you're going to attend and identified like which ones were going to be hard to choose between?
No, I hadn't got to that yet. Thank goodness.
Okay.
No.
Austin.
I remember, Austin, when you gave your first lecture to NORWAC, you were speaking at the same time as like 2 of my other friends. So I had to like split and like sit in for yours for like 15 minutes and then sit in for somebody else's for 15 minutes. And yeah. So you're excited about NORWAC. Are you doing just a talk or are you doing a workshop, Austin?
I'm doing 2 talks and a workshop.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about gemstones and astrology. I think I named it something clever. Yeah, like the celestial lapidary or something like that. From the angle of a couple different traditions, what stones correspond to what planets and how have they been used in magic and in remediation and other things. And then my other lecture is about derived houses. Looking at the chart from drawing houses from points other than the ascendant, such as the part of fortune, or really taking any perspective on the chart, as we might in certain techniques, where we want to look at the chart from the perspective of Mars, right? What's fourth from Mars? What's 10th? What's 7th? What's 9th? Et cetera, et cetera. So we'll be doing houses from houses. And then my workshop is on the decans. We're gonna go through all 36 and then do some talking about how to use them and how they've been used historically.
Nice. That sounds awesome.
Thanks.
And Kelly, you're doing a talk and a workshop or just 2 talks?
2 talks, a keynote, and a workshop.
Oh, okay. So not much.
Not much. It'll be a breeze.
What's your keynote?
It's on friendship, love, and community, and it's inspired by the Venus retrograde in Gemini. So I just wanted to look at the different ways we can interact and create affection and connection, which has taken on a totally different context and meaning now to when I conceived the talk a year ago, but there's plenty of time to factor in current circumstances.
Nice.
And I'm doing a talk on how to combine the progress moon with transits. So it's like one piece of some of my predictive astrology approach. So looking at the progress moon and how that can qualify your experience with major transits like Saturn return or midlife transits or just, Pluto square your sun or what have you. The other talk I'm giving is called Lunar Loving, and the subtitle is 5 Things You Should Know About the Moon But Probably Don't. And it just goes into some of those extra considerations that are really important to know with the moon in terms of things like speed of the moon, phase of the moon, aspects, whether the moon is kind of hanging out in the part of the sky by itself. So we're just going to go into little pieces of some of the older material on the moon that just gets totally overlooked today. And then my post-conference workshop is on the predictive pot of gold. So I'm going to present a lot of my work around combining transits and secondary progressions together, which I just love teaching on. So that's going to be a really fun day. Laura was very kind to adjust the time of my workshop just to honor the fact that I'm in Europe. So we have a slightly earlier start time on Monday, the 25th. I'll be starting at 8:30 a.m. and I think most presenters like Austin will start at 10.
Cool.
What else? In May, I'm also doing a webinar as an intro webinar to SECT on May 16 for Astrology University. So that's something else I've got coming up this month. Just an intro to what SECT is and how you can factor it into your chart interpretation work.
Awesome. That's exciting. And that's for Astrology University. And then I meant to mention the URL again for NORWAC is norwac.net. It looks like Lisa's talks are on zodiac releasing subperiods, which is really exciting because I don't think there's a lot of information or talks on that out there at this point. And then she's doing another talk on weird chart combinations or the astrology of the weird. And Austin, Caitlin's giving a talk on astrology and magic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just wondering what's her topic?
Let me think. It's definitely on astrology and magic. It's sort of living astrology and magic. Like how do these things combine in practice? What is the relationship? How do you what perspective does astrological magic lend to astrology, and how do we apply that? The title was Taking the Lead.
Are you getting the schedule?
Magic.
Excellent. There we go.
Yeah, because NORWAC has a great schedule. Their website they just updated, and it's actually really good now.
Yes.
So Caitlin's talk is Taking the Lead with Astrological Magic. Astrology can sometimes feel like a one-way exchange, us looking to the sky to discover what it has to say about our inner worlds and manifest realities, but how can we introduce more agency and influence over how things unfold in order to build a life and cultivate a character more in alignment with our choosing? Learn how practical applications of planetary magic shift us from passive interpreters to active participants in the dance between fate and free will. That is a very well written. As somebody that's had to write like a lot of lecture descriptions, like I can appreciate how well, because you only have like 75 words, and so you really have to like pick each one carefully, and that's very well crafted.
Caitlin is an exceptional
much better
writer.
Than my mumbling description.
Yeah.
She is.
There's many things about Kate that we love, but her writing skills I have been in awe of for a very long time. Are you gonna put the speakers up too, Chris? That's great.
Yeah, so here's the rest of the speaker list. Colin Bedell, Lynn Bell, who's been on the show, Gemini Brett, who's been on the show, Christine Cottle, who's a fan of the show and is a big supporter, Wade Caves, Austin Coppock, I've heard of him before, Caitlin Coppock, our friend Benjamin Dykes, who's been on the show many times, Stephen Forrest, Demetra, of course, Diana Rose Harper. I'm excited that this is her first talk at NORWAC, I believe.
Yeah.
Judith Hill, who's known for her work on medical astrology, Lawrence Hillman, Jason Hawley is great, Mark Jones, been on the show a few times, Jessica Laniato, Alejo Lopez, Martin Sebastian Moritz, Grace Morris, financial astrologer, Gregory Nalbandian, Lauren Nalbandian, Giulio Pellegrini, who's the new president of AFAN, or the chair of AFAN, Sam Reynolds, Vernon Robinson. Oh, that's great. He's a Denver astrologer I've been wanting to have on the podcast, and I'm hoping to pretty soon here. Bear River is awesome. Sonal Sachdeva, Lisa Scheim, Nadia Shaw, somebody named Kelly Surtees, Kira Sutherland, Simon Vorster, Patricia Walsh, Robert, I thought this was going to be a shorter list, Robert Weinstein, Arlen Wise.
That's okay.
And finally, another friend of this show, Jen Zart. So that's actually a really amazing lineup. Now it's just reminding me of what a great lineup it was going to be, and how I was going back and forth about whether to attend, because I was not speaking there this year, but now I think I will definitely attend.
Yeah. The lineup is really cool. There's some beautiful, there's a lovely mix of new people coming in to speak that I'm very excited to hear about. I think it's Caitlin's first conference talk, Diana Rose Harper, Bear River. So it's going to be great to get some new voices as well.
Definitely. Brilliant.
Yeah.
All right. And Austin, you launched a bunch of stuff. So you're in the middle, like knee deep in teaching courses right now, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll be teaching month 2 of 8 during May. Other than that, like there's, I think some of the stuff I elected for Sphere and Sundry, some of the secretly good moments that were hidden during the not generally good moments the first part of the year. I think Kate's gonna release a thing or two. We'll see. And other than that, I've got NORWAC and trying to keep up with classes and readings.
Brilliant. All right. Kelly's website is kellysurteesastrology.com or kellysastrology.com.
kellysastrology.com. Yeah. Don't forget the S in the middle. It's a common mistake.
Kelly's Astrology. And Austin is austincoppock.com. I'll put links to those in the description below this video. As for me, I'm just going to be slowly getting back to work. I'm going to start getting back to grading student papers. There's been a lot of people who, during quarantine, because they had a lot of time to kill, decided to like learn, invest in knowledge. I've had a lot of people sign up for my Hellenistic astrology course. So I'm excited to work with some of those people and get back to work on the course, and maybe start doing webinars again, and generally, like getting into helping people to learn ancient astrology and learning the type of astrology that we use here on the podcast. So people can find out more information about my courses at theastrologyschool.com. And I think that's it for this episode. So I wanted to thank, this is our most well-attended live recording ever, I believe, where we had, I think, almost 100 participants join us for the live webinar for this episode, which is one of the benefits of becoming a patron of the Astrology Podcast on certain tiers. So thanks a lot to all the patrons who joined us in the live recording. There's been a live chat, which has been a lot of fun. I've been trying to follow, and some of the comments have been really great. Sorry if we didn't get to everybody's questions or interact as much. It's always tough juggling both while we're getting into discussions between the three of us. But thanks also in particular to all the patrons who support the Astrology Podcast and have continued to over the course of the past month since I've been gone and sick. And now that I've come back, I appreciate it, and I appreciate the ability to keep producing material like this, even during times like this, just due to the freedom that that's given me. So I'll be back again next month with a lineup of some great episodes. And yeah, I look forward to seeing everybody again next month. So thanks, guys, for doing the forecast with me.
Thanks
My
so
pleasure.
much. Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast. Good luck next month, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks to the patrons who helped to support the production of this episode of the Astrology Podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to patrons Christine Stone, Nate Craddock, Marin Altman, and Irina Tudor, as well as the AstroGold Astrology app available at astrogold.io, the Portland School of Astrology at portlandastrology.org, and the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs available at honeycomb.co. The production of this episode of the podcast is also supported by the International Society for Astrological Research, which is hosting a major astrology conference in Denver, Colorado, September 10th through the 14th, 2020. More information about that at isar2020.org. And finally, also SolarFire Astrology software, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 for a 15% discount on that software. For more information about how to become a patron of the Astrology Podcast and help support the production of future episodes, while getting access to subscriber benefits like early access to new episodes or other bonus content, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast.